They said Adrian Blackthorne had stood at his first wife's grave and felt nothing, no grief, no guilt, nothing but the particular silence of a man who had already decided the world owed him no more softness. 3 years later, he stood at the altar of his own arranged marriage with that same silence wrapped around him like armor, like a weapon, like a burial shroud he'd chosen to wear while still breathing. The woman beside him was shaking, not from fear, from the effort of pretending she wasn't afraid. He noticed. He always noticed. He simply had no intention of doing anything about it. Some men build walls after they are broken. Adrian Blackthorne had built something far more permanent. He had simply stopped being the kind of man walls were necessary for. Stay until the end. What you're about to witness isn't a love story. It's an excavation. The ceremony lasted 47 minutes. Adrian knew because he had counted, not from impatience, though impatience would have been understandable, but from the particular discipline of a man who had learned that measuring time was the only honest relationship he had left with it. 47 minutes of candlelight and recited words and the distant sound of an orchestra playing something that was meant to suggest romance and succeeded only in suggesting an obligation being discharged in the most expensive way possible. The Blackthorne Estate Chapel held 80 guests. Every seat was filled. Half of them had come because declining an invitation from Adrian Blackthorne was the kind of social error people didn't make twice, and the other half had come because the marriage itself was the season's most compelling spectacle. The feared Duke of Blackthorne taking a second wife, a quiet woman from a fallen noble house, a woman whose family name still carried weight, but whose family coffers carried nothing but echoes. Clara Vale stood beside him in ivory silk that had cost her family the last of 3 good decisions and approximately 4 months of careful saving. The dress was beautiful. The woman wearing it was terrified, and she was doing something Adrian recognized with a kind of grim professional respect. She was performing composure. Her chin was level, her hands were still. Her eyes tracked forward with the disciplined emptiness of someone who had decided long before entering this chapel that she would not allow anyone present to see the full dimension of what this moment cost her. He didn't look at her during the ceremony, not once. He looked at the altar, at the officiant, at the candle flames bending in the draft from the chapel's ancient stone walls, at the particular arrangement of flowers that his household staff had spent 2 weeks planning, and he had never once asked about, or approved, or even acknowledged noticing. He was present in the most technical sense of the word. His body occupied the space beside Clara Vale. His attention was somewhere else entirely, somewhere cold and interior, behind 7 years of carefully constructed distance. When they said the words, he said his. Clara said hers. Her voice didn't shake. He noticed that too. The guests applauded. Someone near the back started crying, the soft kind of crying that people do at weddings, because weddings give them permission to feel things they've been carrying around waiting for an occasion. Adrian signed the registry with the same signature he used for business contracts. Clara signed beside him, her handwriting neat and controlled, the letters leaning slightly forward as though pressed by some invisible wind. And then it was done. The 47th minute arrived and departed and left behind it a marriage. Hooked up. The reception was held in the Blackthorne Estate's Great Hall, a room that had been designed 2 centuries ago by an ancestor with delusions of imperial grandeur and had since accumulated the particular weight of a space that had witnessed more ambition than joy. The ceilings were high enough to make the human voice feel small. The chandeliers held 300 candles. The long tables were dressed with white linen and the estate's formal silver, every piece polished to a severity that suggested the head of household had been informed that a single smudge would result in consequences. The head of household was a man named Holt, 53 years old, 22 years in service to the Blackthorne estate. Built like someone who had once been told that physical impressiveness was a professional requirement and had never stopped believing it. Holt ran the estate's domestic operations with the kind of exhausted competence that comes from long experience serving a master who noticed every flaw and acknowledged no achievement. He had overseen the preparation of this reception with the particular tension of a man whose job security was entirely contingent on nothing going wrong. Nothing went wrong. Adrian sat at the head table and spoke to no one unless spoken to, and when he was spoken to, he responded with a precision that was technically courteous and socially lethal. each answer exactly long enough to fulfill the obligation of response, and short enough to communicate, unmistakably, that he was not interested in continuation. Beside him, Clara sat with a glass of wine she had barely touched, navigating her own set of introductions with what Adrian observed in his peripheral vision was considerably more grace than the situation warranted. A baroness from the eastern provinces took Clara's hand and said something with a wide performance-grade smile. Clara smiled back, while not the same smile, but one that matched the energy without matching the insincerity. She said something in return. The baroness laughed, genuinely, the kind of laugh that requires being caught off guard. A lord 2 seats down leaned in, interested. Clara spoke again, quieter this time, and whatever she said produced a ripple of actual warmth across 3 feet of polished table. Adrian watched this with no expression and filed it somewhere he didn't name. The meal proceeded through its required stages. Toasts were made. His own toast had been prepared by his private secretary, reviewed once, delivered in a flat, even voice that communicated nothing warmer than acknowledgement. Clara's response, he had not told her she would need to give one, because it had not occurred to him that she would, came without preparation, without warning, and lasted perhaps 90 seconds. She thanked the guests for attending. She said something about the honor of carrying the Blackthorne name forward. She said it with exactly the right amount of warmth and exactly the right amount of restraint, and when she sat back down, the hall was quieter in a way that suggested she had cleared some invisible bar no one had announced. Adrian picked up his wine glass, put it down without drinking. After the final course, when the orchestra had shifted from dinner music to something with an implied invitation to dance, he leaned close enough to be heard without being overheard. "You'll want to stay another hour," he said, "for appearances. After that you can retire. I won't require your company." Clara turned her head to look at him. It was the first time they had directly looked at each other since the vows. Her eyes were gray, a specific shade of gray that wasn't soft or pale but dense, like storm-laden clouds that hadn't yet decided what they were going to do. There was something in them that wasn't fear anymore, something that had been fear and had metabolized into something else, something quieter and harder. "I understand," she said. He nodded once and looked away. 63 minutes later, Clara Vale, Clara Blackthorne, technically, though she would not learn to think of herself that way for some time, excused herself from a conversation about estate gardens with 3 guests who seemed genuinely disappointed to see her go, and disappeared up the main staircase. The hall continued without her. Adrian watched the space she had vacated for approximately 4 seconds. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out through the side corridor that led to his private study. What? The study had a fire going. Holt always made sure the fire was going when Adrian retreated here at the end of evenings. The room smelled of old books and wood smoke and something faint and mineral that was simply the smell of stone that had stood for 2 centuries and absorbed everything that had ever happened inside it. Adrian poured himself a drink, stood at the window. Outside, the estate grounds were dark and cold, November having arrived with its usual disdain for warmth. The formal gardens below were stripped and bare, the fountain at their center turned off for the season, a stone basin gathering fallen leaves and shadow. He drank. He thought about nothing, because Adrian Blackthorne had long ago achieved the discipline of thinking about nothing on purpose, of standing inside a silence of his own manufacture and staying there until whatever feeling had begun to surface was submerged again beneath the more manageable business of control. There was a knock at the door. "Come." It was Holt. He entered with the careful tread of a man who had learned to gauge his employer's mood from the angle of his shoulders and the speed at which drinks were being consumed. "The last guests are departing, sir. I wanted to confirm that I've had the Duchess's rooms prepared as requested. The East Wing, 2nd floor." "Good. She's settled in, I believe." Mrs. Ashbury attended her. Mrs. Ashbury was the head housekeeper, a woman of 60 who had served the estate for 16 years and operated with a maternal authority that the household had long since accepted as more binding than most formal arrangements. The fact that Holt mentioned her specifically was his subtle way of confirming that Clara was being looked after. The fact that he felt the need to confirm it was his subtle way of communicating that the staff had noticed what the wedding had been. Tell Mrs. Ashbury the Duchess is to have full access to all common areas of the estate, Adrian said. She is to be treated with complete courtesy. Of course, sir. That means without exception, Holt. If I hear that any member of this household has treated her as a guest or a temporary arrangement rather than the Duchess of Blackthorne, I will consider that a direct failure of your supervision. Holt's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Understood perfectly, sir. Is there anything else? No, sir. Good night. Holt withdrew. The door closed without sound. Adrian turned back to the window. The word temporary had left his mouth without premeditation and landed somewhere uncomfortable. He considered it for a moment, considered the way he had felt the need to say it, the way its opposite had apparently needed asserting. He finished his drink, poured another, did not finish the second. The fire burned down to embers by the time he left the study and climbed the stairs to his own chambers on the third floor, at the opposite end of the estate from the east wing, from the room where his wife of 6 hours was sleeping or not sleeping in a bed that smelled of different linen than her own. He did not think about that. 3 days after the wedding, they had their first real conversation. It was not planned. It was the kind of thing that happens in large houses when two people trying to avoid each other accidentally achieve the same location at the same time, a collision of solitude. The library occupied the estate's entire western wing of the second floor, a long room with walls of shelves that rose 14 feet and required rolling ladders on brass rails to reach the upper volumes. Adrian used the library at 6 in the morning, before the household was fully active, because it was the only time the room was reliably empty. He had established this routine sometime in the second year after his first wife's death and had not yet had cause to change it. Clara was sitting in the leather chair nearest the east window when he walked in. She had a book open across her knees, something from the history section, he noted, not the novels which occupied the west wall and which most people assumed were the library's primary attraction. She was wearing a dark blue robe over her nightgown, her dark hair loose, one foot tucked under her and the other resting on the floor. She looked entirely comfortable. She looked like someone who had been coming to this room for years and had simply never been noticed. She looked up when he entered. Neither of them spoke for a moment. I wasn't told this room was off limits, Clara said. Her voice was level, not apologetic. It isn't. Then I'll assume my presence here is acceptable. I said it isn't off limits. That's not quite the same as acceptable. He studied her for a moment. In the morning light, without the ceremony's formality and the reception's performance, she looked younger and also somehow older. Younger in the way that people always look younger when they are not performing. Older in the way that certain people carry experience, like weather. Read your book, he said, and walked to the opposite end of the room. He could hear her turn a page approximately 4 minutes later. He chose a volume from the section on trade law, not because he needed it, but because it was close, and sat at the reading table near the window at the far end. The room was large enough that they were 30 feet apart. The silence between them was the silence of two people who had silently agreed to pretend the other was not present, and it was a different silence than the silence of an empty room, and Adrian noticed the difference without acknowledging it. He read 12 pages. Clara turned her book's pages at irregular intervals that suggested genuine reading rather than performance of reading. When he stood to leave, he did not say anything. Clara also said nothing. He was at the door when she spoke. The section on natural philosophy is missing the third volume of Hardcastle's collected works, she said, without looking up from her own book. It appears to have been shelved incorrectly. I found it in the agricultural records. I put it back where it belongs. He stopped. When did you find this? Yesterday. I hope that's all right. I wasn't moving things arbitrarily. A brief pause. I noticed the gap and looked for the volume. It seemed wasteful to leave it misplaced. The Hardcastle third volume had been missing for approximately 2 years. His previous librarian, now retired, had noted its absence in a ledger and filed that notation in the same place he had apparently filed all other problems that were not immediately his responsibility. Thank you, Adrian said. It was the only word of genuine thanks he had offered since the wedding, and it fell into the room with a slight awkwardness, the awkwardness of something that had come out more real than intended. Clara looked up then, just briefly. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite pleasure. It was more careful than both. "You're welcome," she said, and looked back at her book. He left. In the corridor, walking back to the east staircase, he became aware that he had told her to read her book. He had told her, in his own library, in her own house, 3 days into a marriage he had designed to require nothing from her, to read her book, as though she had needed his permission to be present in a room that was as much hers as his. He considered this for approximately 10 seconds. He did not go back and address it. He was not that kind of man. He had been, once, in the way that very young people can be that kind of man, attentive and corrective, and willing to double back on a wrong note and try again. That person had been carved out of him with the specific instrument of a betrayal so complete that he still didn't think about it in full, only in the pieces he could manage without it spreading. He went back to his rooms. He worked for 6 hours straight. He did not think about Clara's gray eyes in the morning light, or about the missing Hardcastle volume, or about the precise temperature of the word. "You're welcome" when it came from a woman who had every reason to be cold. Dumped. The first formal dinner was held 4 days post-wedding, a Thursday, at 7 in the evening. Adrian had established formal dinners as a weekly obligation, not because he wanted them, but because a household requires structure, and structure requires ritual, and ritual requires at least the appearance of a family unit functioning in good faith. His first marriage had taught him that, among other things. The dining room seated 20, but was set for 2. The distance between the head of table and the second place was the distance between 2 countries that shared a border. Clara arrived 2 minutes early. He noticed because he arrived 2 minutes early himself, and she was already there, standing near the window, and she turned at his entrance with the composed expression of someone who had spent the preceding 48 hours deciding exactly how much of herself to bring to this table. They sat. The staff served the first course. Adrian looked at his food. "You've been in the household accounts," he said. Across the table, Clara set down her fork with the deliberate precision of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had not expected it this soon. "Yes. The household accounts are Mrs. Ashbury's domain. Mrs. Ashbury showed them to me voluntarily. She said you've been meaning to review the supplier contracts for some time and haven't had occasion." A pause. "I had occasion." "And what did you find?" She looked at him steadily. "That your provisions merchant has been billing for premium-grade grain and delivering mid-grade at roughly twice the frequency he should. Over 18 months, that's a significant sum. I've drafted a letter to his firm and a suggested protocol for future verification. Something in Adrian's chest, not his heart, not anything that poetic, but something in the architecture of his attention, shifted almost imperceptibly. You drafted a letter. I thought it would save time." She met his gaze. "If you'd prefer I hadn't, I can withdraw it. It hasn't been sent." The dinner service moved quietly around them. A candle flame bent in an invisible current. "Send it," Adrian said. Clara looked back at her plate. A slight adjustment in her jaw. Something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't attempting to be, passed across her face in the time it took for her to lift her fork again. The meal continued. 45 minutes later, at the end of the third course, Adrian said, not looking at her, looking at his wine glass, "The East Wing's upper corridor has a draft. The window casement should have been replaced last spring. I'll have Holt schedule it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That would be appreciated," she said. "It's colder than it needs to be." He nodded once. She turned her wine glass a quarter turn, the way people do when their hands need something to do that doesn't announce itself. "You could have said something earlier," he said, "about the cold." "You're a man who appears to have made peace with discomfort," Clara said. "I didn't assume it would register as significant." He looked at her then. She held the look without flinching, without filling the silence that followed it with qualifications or apologies. Her gray eyes were direct, not challenging, not performing the kind of confrontation that is actually an appeal for reaction. Just direct. Just present. "Don't make assumptions about what registers," he said. "Then tell me what does." The words were quiet. They were not a demand. They were the kind of invitation that only a certain kind of person issues, the kind who already understands the risk involved in asking and has decided the information is worth it. Adrian looked at the candle flame. "Results," he said finally. "Work that gets done. Problems that stop existing. He picked up his glass. Noise does not register. Clara absorbed this. Her expression did not change in a way that registered as hurt, though he was, and this troubled him in its own quiet way, watching for it. "That's a useful piece of information," she said. "Thank you." He said nothing. She asked him nothing further. They finished the meal in the kind of silence that, for the first time in a very long time, did not feel entirely like absence. The weeks did something he hadn't planned for. They accumulated. Days built on days the way sediment builds, invisibly, without announcement, layer by compressed layer until one morning you look at the landscape and realize it is not the same landscape it was. The estate, which had functioned for 3 years since his first wife's death, with the cold efficiency of a machine nobody loved, began doing something in Clara's presence that Adrian tracked with the same detached attention he applied to all phenomena he could not immediately categorize. It began warming, not in any temperature Adrian could have recorded, but in the way a house warms when someone inside it begins to treat it as a place worth caring for. Clara spent her second week asking questions. She did not ask Adrian, she asked Holt, she asked Mrs. Ashbury, she asked the groundskeeper, a weathered man named Taro who had spent 30 years tending the estate's 12 acres with the particular commitment of someone who understood that land had memory. She asked what had been neglected, what had been planned and abandoned, what had worked once and could work again. She listened in the way that people who actually intend to use information listen, not nodding, not performing attention, but going still. By the third week, she had proposed a seasonal restoration schedule for the kitchen gardens with Taro, drafted a revised service rotation with Mrs. Ashbury that redistributed work more equitably and reduced the fraying of 2 long-term members of staff who had been quietly burning toward resignation, and initiated a conversation with the estate's carpenter about the chapel's rotting window frames. She did none of this loudly. She did not bring it to Adrian for approval or acknowledgement or credit. She simply did the work, and the work began to show, the way quiet, consistent work always shows. Not in sudden dramatic transformation, but in the gradual disappearance of things that had been wrong. Adrian heard about it secondhand. He heard about it from Holt's reports, from the subtle shift in the household's daily operation, from the sound of laughter in the kitchen corridor on a Thursday afternoon, a sound he had not heard in this house in 3 years, and which stopped him mid-step in the hallway above, just for a moment, before he continued. He started watching her. Not deliberately, not with any announced intention, not with any of the warm, obvious attention that watching a person usually implies. It was the watching of a man who had been trained, by profession, by survival, to notice anomalies, and Clara Vale had become, without either of them choosing it, an anomaly worth noting. He watched her at the week's second formal dinner refuse to be condescended to by a visiting nobleman, a man named Garrett Stowe, whose family had made their money recently enough that their arrogance still wore the fresh shine of insecurity. Stowe made a comment about estate management being beyond the understanding of women who had come up in houses that hadn't managed much. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who had found this kind of remark amusing in enough rooms to stop noticing when it wasn't. Clara's expression did not change. "Lord Stowe," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by 3 people on each side of the table and no further, "I've found that people who question others' competence rarely do so from a position of surplus." She picked up her wine glass. "How are the Northern Holdings managing this season?" Stowe's Northern Holdings were, as 3 people at that table knew, in a state of pronounced difficulty following a series of decisions that had been widely discussed in the kind of tones people reserve for preventable disasters. The question landed like a blade dressed as a social inquiry. Stowe recovered. He laughed, performed recovery, redirected. But the room had felt it. The room had registered in the particular way that rooms of powerful people register these small, perfect acts of violence, that Clara Blackthorne had just demonstrated something about herself that would be repeated at other tables for weeks. Adrian looked at his plate. He was not smiling. He was doing the thing he did when something registered as correct, a small, private, cellular-level acknowledgement that what he had just witnessed was the right thing executed with precision. The night of the royal gathering arrived in the 2nd month of their marriage, in the last week before November deepened into something genuinely brutal. The gathering was held at the home of Lord Carver Aldith, a man who styled himself a political centrist and operated as one only in the sense that he occupied the center of every room and waited for the most powerful current to pull him somewhere useful. The event gathered 40 of the country's most significant noble families, plus retainers and extended household, in a space that had been designed to communicate, without subtlety, the meaning of old money. Clara wore dark green silk. Her jewelry was simple, a single piece, a pin at her shoulder that had belonged to her mother, silver with a small inset stone that caught the candlelight without demanding attention. She entered the room on Adrian's arm, and within 10 minutes had been absorbed into a cluster of women whose conversation he could not hear from where he stood with the men who considered themselves the evening's real business. Count Darian Velth arrived an hour in. Velth was 58. He had been a significant man once, in the way that significance sometimes attaches to people who occupy the right family name and the right era without doing much to justify it, and he had spent the subsequent 2 decades watching that significance erode while performing the certainty that it hadn't. He was the kind of man who compensated for diminishment by ensuring someone near him was further diminished. He found Clara near the room's secondary fireplace, in conversation with 2 women from Aldith's extended household. Adrian was across the room. He was not watching. He had not been watching. He had been engaged in a conversation about the Crown's Eastern trade policy that required his attention and was getting approximately 15% of it. The sound that redirected the remaining 85% was not loud. It was a laugh, Velth's laugh, the kind specifically engineered to travel, and then a voice pitched at exactly the volume required to be heard by everyone in a 6-foot radius while maintaining the fiction of private conversation. One does wonder, Velth was saying, what a man of Blackthorne's standing finds to discuss with a woman whose family couldn't maintain a single solvent estate. I suppose the Duke has acquired a decorative piece, very fashionable in its way. The 2 women Clara had been speaking with went still. Clara's face, Adrian was across the room, but he was watching now with the full, cold, absolute attention that he applied to moments that required it, did not change. It was the second time in 2 months he had seen that specific stillness in her face, the stillness of a person who has been hurt and decided, in the same breath, not to grant the wound its desired effect. She said something quiet. He couldn't hear it. Velth laughed again, louder. Adrian set down his wine glass. He crossed the room in the way he crossed rooms when the outcome had already been decided, without haste, which would suggest urgency, without performance, which would suggest theater. Just directional, just inevitable. The crowd did not part so much as recede, the way water moves for something that has displaced it simply by existing in the same space. He stopped directly beside Clara, not in front of her, beside her. "Velth," he said. The Count turned. His expression went through several adjustments in rapid succession, each one a calculation, none of them quite landing on the right answer. "Blackthorne," Velth said. Hearty, practiced. "I was just saying to your—" "I heard what you were saying." Adrian's voice was not raised. It was the voice he used when raising it would be wasteful, flat and precise as a surgical instrument. "I'd like you to look at her when you apologize." The room had gone. In that particular way rooms go, very quiet. Velth's face cycled. "I meant no offense." "You absolutely meant offense. That's the only reason the remark existed." Adrian held the silence for exactly 1 beat. "The question is whether you are going to embarrass yourself further or take the available exit." Velth looked at Clara. She was watching him with gray eyes that were entirely composed, entirely without mercy, entirely without the slightest invitation to be rescued or pitied. She was waiting, the way a person waits who already knows the outcome and has simply decided to be present for it. "My apologies," Velth said. His voice had lost approximately half its natural register. "I spoke carelessly." "You did?" Clara said. "Nothing more." Velth withdrew. The crowd's attention reallocated. Conversations resumed, quieter at first, the way water moves after something has been thrown into it. Adrian stood beside her for 1 more moment. He didn't look at her. "Are you all right?" he said. Not quite a question. "Yes," Clara said. Not quite the answer. He looked at her then. She was looking at the far side of the room, at Velt's retreating back, with an expression that was controlled and complete, and behind which Adrian, who had spent 7 years reading rooms and people and the distance between what faces showed and what they meant, could identify, like a fault line in otherwise solid stone, something that was not all right, something that had been hit and was doing the extraordinary work of standing after it. He didn't say anything else. He didn't leave her side for the remainder of the evening. He wasn't sure when that had become something he was capable of wanting. He told himself it was tactical, that a duke's wife publicly diminished reflected badly on the Blackthorne name, that this was management of a household asset, that there was nothing in his standing beside Clara Blackthorne at a social gathering that could not be explained entirely by calculation. He was not a man who had much patience for his own lies, but he was a man who knew the value of maintaining them a little longer. Chap. It was Holt who first said anything, not directly. Holt had survived 22 years in Adrian's employment by having the judgment to never say anything directly about anything that mattered. He said things sideways, in the manner of a man who had long understood that the only intelligence that survives being delivered to a powerful and private person is the intelligence dressed as something else. They were reviewing estate schedules in Adrian's study, the first week of December, a cold morning with sleet hitting the windows and the irregular rhythm of something that hadn't decided yet how serious it meant to be. The Duchess has requested the appointment of 2 additional ground staff for the spring restoration, Holt said. Tarot has approved the request from a technical standpoint. Approve it. Yes, sir. A pause, the length of a single breath. She's also been reviewing the correspondence files. The older ones, or the business correspondence from the past 4 years. With your secretary's permission, she's made several organizational suggestions. Adrian looked at him. My secretary approved access to my business correspondence files. She was quite persuasive, sir, in the way that she is. She explained she wasn't reading the content, she was reviewing the filing system. She felt it had some structural inefficiencies. Holt's expression managed to be entirely neutral. She was not wrong about that. What did she find? She found the filing system, sir. What you find in a filing system is mostly the system. Holt. The older man set down his papers. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone gathering a thing carefully. She's been very good for this house, he said. I thought you should know, if you didn't already, Mrs. Ashbury feels the same. Tarot said last week that the estate hasn't felt, his word, sir, alive in some time. And now it does. He picked his papers back up. I simply thought that was worth saying. Adrian looked at the window. The sleet had made a soft, insistent percussion against the glass. Is that all? That's all, sir. Good. Leave the schedule on the desk. Holt left. Adrian sat for a long time after that, in the chair at his desk, his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular. The study fire was going, the way it always was, the way Holt always made sure it was, this small and consistent act of care that had accumulated over 22 years into something Adrian could not name and did not try to. He thought about Clara in the library, Clara at the dinner table, Clara's expression when Velt's laugh had traveled across a room designed to carry exactly that kind of thing. He thought about what alive meant, about who had most recently made him think of it. He picked up a work file, put it down. He went to the window and looked out at the estate grounds, at the formal gardens in their winter state, stripped bare, patient with the season's demands. At the fountain, still turned off. At the garden paths that Tarot had cleared of leaves at Clara's request, the stone edges freshly defined against the dormant grass. Something shifted in him, not seismically, not dramatically, but in the way tectonic things shift, slowly, invisibly, with consequences that won't be visible for some time. He recognized the feeling the way you recognize a smell from years ago. Not with pleasure, not with welcome, but with the particular and somewhat alarming accuracy of recognition itself. He had been here before, a different version of here, with a different woman, before the learning that had cost him everything he'd previously understood about what love was capable of taking. He turned away from the window. He went back to his desk. He opened the work file. He spent the next 3 hours being extremely productive, and he did not think about Clara. and he was only partially successful at both. The documents were in the East Studies secondary filing cabinet. This was a room Adrian rarely used, a smaller office adjacent to the main estate archives that had served, during his father's tenure, as an overflow space for the estate's less critical correspondence. Since taking the dukedom, Adrian had used it approximately twice a year for the kind of administrative archaeology that couldn't be delegated and didn't fit anywhere else. Clara should not have been in it. She had access to the common areas, to the library, to the household management records, to the sections of the archive Holt had opened at her request. This room, whose existence she would only have learned from the staff, from the estate's layout, from the kind of careful attention to detail that had become her defining characteristic, was not in that category. She had been in it. Adrian discovered this on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of December, when he entered the East Study for the first time in 4 months and found, on the secondary desk, a neat arrangement of folders that had not been there in 4 months, because they had been in the filing cabinet, disordered and unreviewed, and filed with the vague intention of eventual attention. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He walked to the desk. The folders had been organized with the same logic Clara had applied to the household accounts, chronological, cross-referenced, with the kind of systematic clarity that requires not just intelligence but patience. She had not gone through everything. There were sections still in the cabinet, clearly untouched, but what she had organized was organized with care. He opened the first folder. Estate maintenance contracts, 3 years back. The next. Supplier agreements, mixed provenance. The third folder was different. It was labeled, in handwriting he recognized as neither his own nor his secretary's, labeled in Clara's careful, forward-leaning script, simply, Discrepancy Review. Inside were 6 sheets of paper. Her handwriting throughout, dense, precise notes, cross-referencing dates and figures. At the top of the first sheet, 3 words underlined twice. This doesn't reconcile. His eyes moved down the page. His hand, which had been resting against the desk, became still. What Clara had found, what she had assembled across 6 sheets of careful, methodical investigation, was not a clerical error. It was not a coincidence of filing. It was the outline of something that had been deliberately obscured, systematic financial diversions from the estate's primary operating accounts, small enough individually to evade casual detection, large enough in aggregate to constitute something with a specific, serious word attached to it. And it had been running, according to the dates Clara had traced, for nearly 2 years. He read every sheet. He read them twice. His face was completely still, the way it was when he was working, when the work involved something that required the complete subordination of everything else. At the bottom of the 6th sheet, a note, also underlined. The routing pattern on these transfers, they go through Aldrich's signature authority. I need to verify, but I think you need to see this. Aldrich. Marcus Aldrich, his estate's chief advisor, 12 years in service, the man who had stood at his left hand through the worst years after the first marriage, after the loss, through the process of rebuilding the estate's financial standing from the wreckage of a grief-paralyzed administration. The man Adrian had trusted with the full authority of the estate's financial operations because trust, once granted after all trust had been burned out of you, was either complete or it was nothing. Adrian stood very still. He had been wrong about people before. About one person, specifically, in a way that had restructured everything he understood about his own judgment. He had told himself, after that he had accounted for the lesson, that the cost of learning it had at least purchased him accuracy. He was looking at 6 sheets of paper that told him, with the cool patience of mathematics, that he had been wrong again. The fire in the grate made a sound like something settling. Adrian closed the folder. He set it down with the specific precision of someone managing a very controlled and very dangerous response. He looked at the door. He thought about where Clara was. She would be in the main house at this hour, likely the library or the west sitting room, which had become hers by habit over the past weeks. He needed to verify. The documents needed corroboration from the primary accounts before this became something he acted on, because he was a man who had learned, at great cost, the catastrophic consequence of acting on incomplete information. He would review the primary accounts tonight. He would have a definitive answer by morning. He closed the east study. He walked back through the estate's main corridor, past the formal rooms toward the main staircase. He was not thinking about the betrayal. Not yet. Not until it was confirmed. He was doing what he did, compartmentalizing with the aggressive efficiency of a man who understood that to open all the doors at once was to lose the ability to close any of them. He was at the foot of the main stairs when he heard it. A sound from outside. Distant. Wrong in a way that took him less than a second to identify, because it was a sound he had heard before, in a context that had required all of his attention. It was the particular percussion of something burning. He crossed to the east-facing window, pushed it open. Cold air hit him like a flat hand. Down the estate's main drive, at the carriage house and the covered turnabout where the family vehicles were kept. Clara's carriage. She had been scheduled to visit one of the estate's tenant families that afternoon, the kind of visit she had begun making in the third week of their marriage, and which the household had stopped thinking of as unusual. She had left at 4. It was now 6:10. The carriage was at the far end of the drive, halfway between the estate entrance gate and the house. It should have been back by 5. It wasn't back. It was stopped. And from it, from the interior of it, the specific concentrated point of it, came the sharp particular color of fire. Adrian was running before the full meaning of what he was seeing had assembled itself into language, running through the front hall, past Holt, who appeared from somewhere and said something Adrian didn't stop to hear, down the front steps and across the gravel drive in the December dark, with the sleet hitting him and his lungs filling with cold air, and the carriage at the far end of the drive burning with the specific, terrible confidence of a fire that had been set. She was in there. She was in there and the door was jammed. He could see it from 40 feet. The handle fused, the kind of fuse that happens when something is not an accident, the kind that someone who has studied these things recognizes immediately. And the fire was coming from underneath as well as inside, 2 points of origin, and the smoke was thick and black and internal. He hit the door with his shoulder. Once. Twice. The third time the wood gave. Old wood, older than the lock, surrendering to force rather than design. And the door swung open and the smoke came out in a rolling wave that hit him in the face and temporarily removed his ability to see. He went in anyway. The interior was dense and hot. The fire was in the walls, in the upholstery, running the floor in a line from front to rear with the geometry of acceleration. He could see her. He could see the shape of her, on the carriage floor, collapsed, overcome by the smoke before the flames had reached her, and he crossed the burning interior and picked her up with the specific, furious efficiency of someone who has refused to negotiate with the worst possible outcome. He got her out. He was on the drive, on his knees, Clara across his arms, when the carriage's interior fully caught. The sound of it, the sudden acceleration of the fire feeding on itself, and the heat pushed against them like a wall. She was breathing. Barely, shallowly, but breathing. He was holding her the way he had sworn. The night of their wedding, he would never hold her. Close, completely, with both arms, with no distance between them. He was aware of this with the detached, precise part of his mind that kept functioning even when the rest of him had abandoned its protocols. The part of him that was not detached was doing something else entirely. It was registering, with terrible and complete clarity, what the world would have been if he had arrived 90 seconds later. It was registering what that absence would have meant. Clara's eyes opened. Barely. The gray of them was smoky, unfocused, blinking against the cold air and the firelight and the presence of him. Closer than he had ever been, closer than their wedding night, closer than every deliberate and protected distance he had constructed in 7 years of deciding he was through with proximity. Her lips moved. I found, she started and coughed, a hard, racking cough that tightened her entire body, and he pulled her closer automatically, instinctively, without a single managed thought. Don't talk, he said. Adrian. Her voice was rough with smoke. Her eyes, though barely open, had found his face with a focus that was more alert than it should have been, more urgent than someone who had just been pulled from a burning carriage had any business being. It's Aldrich, the documents, in the East Study. I left them there for you. It's Aldrich." Holt had reached them. The groundskeeper, 2 members of the night staff, people arriving with water, with blankets, with the organized panic of a household mobilizing for catastrophe. Adrian did not look at any of them. He was looking at Clara, at the face of a woman who had been set on fire for finding the truth, who had been found by a man who had sworn to feel nothing for her, and who was looking back at him with gray eyes, still doing the work of staying conscious long enough to make sure he knew what she had found. "I know," he said. His voice came out different than he intended, lower, something exposed in it, something that hadn't been there before and could not be put back. "I already know." She closed her eyes. Around them the carriage burned, and inside Adrian Blackthorne, behind 7 years of cultivated silence, behind the walls he had built from grief and betrayal, and the absolute certainty that he would never again be the kind of man who could be this afraid of losing someone, something broke open. Not gently, not with any of the careful, managed grace of the man he had trained himself to be. Completely. The man who had promised never to touch his wife was holding her with both hands and could not imagine letting go, and somewhere in the estate above them, in a room he now understood with the cold precision of a man whose trust had been bought and spent and turned against him, the man who had done this was still inside. The estate's physician arrived in 11 minutes. Adrian knew because he counted again, not from the same discipline as the wedding, not from the managed distance of a man measuring time to stay inside it, but from the particular animal urgency of someone who needed the number to hold on to while everything else was moving too fast and in too many directions at once. 11 minutes. He spent all 11 of them in the ground floor receiving room where they had carried Clara, kneeling on stone that was cold through his trousers, one hand at her back while she coughed the smoke out of her lungs in hard, ragged intervals that sounded like something tearing. He did not speak. He did not comfort her with language, because language, in this moment, was not the point, and he knew it. He kept his hand at her back and felt each cough move through her, and breathed steadily, the way you breathe near a person who is struggling to breathe, like you can lend them the rhythm. Holt stood in the doorway. He had the specific stillness of a man who understood that his presence was required and his interference was not. The physician, Graves, the estate's contracted doctor, a compact man of 50 with the unhurried competence of someone who had seen enough emergencies to stop performing urgency, examined Clara with efficient hands and a running quiet commentary directed at himself more than anyone else. Smoke inhalation. No burns beyond the skin of her forearms, minor, pulse elevated but regular. She was conscious by the time he finished, propped against the settee's arm with her eyes fully open and the gray in them sharpened to something that was close to anger. "You need rest and clean air," Graves said. "No exertion for 48 hours. I'll leave a compound for the throat." "I'm fine," Clara said. "You were inside a burning carriage for approximately 4 minutes," Graves said without looking up from his bag. "You're not fine. You're ambulatory, which is different." Clara looked at Adrian. He was still kneeling. He became aware of this and stood, not quickly, with the deliberate control of a man choosing each movement. He was still holding, had been, without deciding to, one of her hands. He released it. She noticed him releasing it. He saw her notice. "The driver," Clara said. "Alive," Holt said from the doorway. "He jumped when the fire started. Broken wrist. He said the undercarriage caught without warning." "It didn't catch without warning," Adrian said. His voice came out flat, which was not the same as calm. "Get him inside. I want to speak with him before anyone else does." Holt moved. Graves finished and left his instructions with Mrs. Ashbury, who had materialized in the doorway sometime in the preceding minutes, with the specific expression of a woman who had made a decision and was implementing it. She looked at Adrian across the room with something in her face that was not quite an accusation and was not quite a question, and whatever it was, he did not have an answer for it yet. "Mrs. Ashbury," he said. "The Duchess's rooms." "I'll have everything ready." She crossed to Clara. "Can you walk?" "I've been walking since I was 11 months old," Clara said, and stood and swayed and accepted Mrs. Ashbury's arm without further comment. She looked at Adrian once more before she left the room. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained something he couldn't fully read, which was unusual. He could read most things, had trained himself to read most things, and the fact that he couldn't read it sat in his chest like a stone dropped in deep water, still descending. Then she was gone, and he was alone in the receiving room with a fire in the grate and the faint smell of smoke that had followed them in from outside, and Marcus Aldrich, somewhere above him in this house. The driver's name was Pell. He had worked the estate's carriage service for 6 years, a quiet man, mid-30s, with the kind of face that carried weather without complaint. He sat in the servants' hall with his wrist wrapped and his eyes doing the thing that eyes do after a narrow escape, still processing, still not entirely convinced the danger was past. Adrian sat across from him. He did not ask Holt to stay. "Tell me what happened," Adrian said. "Exactly," Pell told him. His voice was steady, in the manner of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than composure right now. The carriage had been prepared that morning as usual. He had collected Clara at 4, taken the east road to the Tenor farm, waited the usual duration, turned back. Approximately a mile from the estate gates, he had smelled the smoke. He'd pulled up immediately, started to climb down, and that was when the fire came from underneath. Fast, already established, not the way an accidental fire moves. "Someone was under the carriage," Pell said. Adrian looked at him. "While we were stopped at Tenor's." "Has to be. The fire was already going when I smelled it. That much in that short a time, it doesn't start from road friction or a hot axle. Someone packed something under the rear compartment and lit it while it was standing. The Duchess was inside the whole time we were at Tenor's. She doesn't come out at the tenant visits, usually. She stays in the carriage and works." He paused. Whoever did it knew that. Adrian was quiet for long enough that Pell shifted. "You did nothing wrong," Adrian said. "Go get the wrist properly seen to. Don't discuss this with the other staff." Pell nodded once and left. Adrian stayed in the empty servants' hall for a minute and a half. He was not thinking in the uncontrolled, cascading way that fear produces in most people. He was doing the opposite, contracting inward, narrowing, running the thing through the part of his mind that had been built for exactly this: threat assessment, source identification, consequence mapping. The anger was present. It wasn't the hot, surface kind. It was the deep geological kind that doesn't rush because it doesn't need to, because it has already committed to outcome and is simply waiting on timing. Someone had known Clara's schedule, known she stayed in the carriage during tenant visits, known the route, the timing, the personnel. The number of people with access to all 3 of those things was very small. He went upstairs. Marcus Aldrich's apartments were in the north wing, 3rd floor, the estate's historical guest quarters, which had been converted to advisor's residence during his father's tenure and which Aldrich had occupied with increasing comfort over the past 12 years. The rooms were well appointed, a working study, a sitting room, sleeping quarters. Aldrich had brought books, art, the accumulated confidence of a man who understood himself to be essential. Adrian knocked once. The door opened within seconds. Aldrich had not been in bed, despite the hour, which told its own story. He was dressed. His expression went through the calculation Adrian had seen on Velth's face at the gathering, except Aldrich was better at it, because Aldrich had had 12 years to calibrate to Adrian specifically. "I heard about the carriage," Aldrich said. "Is the Duchess—" "She's alive." Adrian stepped inside. He did not wait for an invitation. "Close the door." Aldrich closed it. He was a lean man, 60, with silver hair and the particular kind of bearing that comes from spending decades in proximity to power without quite having it. His face was composed. His hands were still. He was performing the concerned advisor, and he was doing it well, and Adrian looked at him across the sitting room and felt something solidify completely. The last remaining question about what the 6 sheets of paper meant. A man who had done nothing stood like Aldrich was standing right now. A man who had done something stood like this too. The difference was a quality of attention, a specific, managed, almost perfect stillness that had a fraction more effort in it than genuine stillness required. Adrian had interrogated enough people over the years to know the weight of that fraction. "Walk me through the estate's transfer accounts for the past 2 years," Adrian said. Aldrich's expression did not change. Now. Now. Adrian, it's past 9, and given what just happened with your Marcus, the name was a closed door. Walk me through them. A pause. A single, barely there recalibration in Aldrich's eyes. Of course, he said. Let me get the ledgers. He moved toward the study. Adrian watched him move. He watched the path Aldrich chose to reach the desk, the slightly wider arc that took him past the bookcase on the south wall, and he watched what Aldrich's right hand did when it reached the level of the second shelf. Nothing. Nothing visible. But the path had been chosen for a reason. Leave the books, Adrian said. Aldrich stopped. Turn around. Aldrich turned. His face had lost approximately 15% of its composure. The 15% that was gone told Adrian everything the remaining 85% was working to conceal. I want to know, Adrian said, and his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very final. How long you thought this was going to work? The room held the question. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Something in the older man's face moved. Not guilt exactly, but the cousin of guilt. The expression of a person whose calculation has finally come to its end and is looking at the arithmetic. He crossed to the chair nearest the cold fireplace and sat down. And in sitting down, he seeded something, and they both knew it. Sit down, Adrian, Aldrich said. I'll stand. Fine, Aldrich folded his hands. How much did she find? The word she landed in the room like something thrown. Enough, Adrian said. How much is there? A long breath. More than the e-study files show. How much more? A significant sum, over approximately 26 months. Aldrich's voice was even, not remorseful, the evenness of a man who had made a decision and was now inhabiting its consequences with the dignity he believed he was owed. I want you to understand the context. I don't need context, I need a number. You need both. Aldrich's eyes came up, and in them was something that Adrian had not expected. Not fear, not guilt, but something that looked with a nauseating precision, like conviction. The estate has been underperforming for 3 years. Your administration of the northern contracts cost us a significant leverage position. I made decisions to offset that. I made them without your approval because I knew you would refuse them. So you stole. I reinvested. Into what? A pause. Lord Aldith's consortium. Adrian went very still. Carver Aldith, the man whose gathering had hosted Velth's public humiliation of Clara, the man who occupied the center of every room waiting for currents. Aldith's consortium, a private investment vehicle that Adrian had reviewed and declined 18 months ago because he had looked at the structure of it and seen, beneath the financial language, the shape of a political instrument. Aldith's consortium, Adrian said, is a vehicle for consolidating proxy influence over the Crown's eastern appointments. It's a vehicle for positioning this estate favorably in the next decade's political landscape. Aldrich's voice had taken on the tone of a man who had rehearsed this explanation and believed it. You are too conservative, Adrian. You always have been. You hold this estate at arm's length from the alliances that would protect it, the same way you hold everyone at arm's length from— Be very careful, Adrian said. Aldrich stopped. He read the room. He recalibrated. The money can be returned, he said. In full, over a period that— The carriage, Adrian said. Silence. Clara's carriage tonight was deliberately set on fire. She was inside it. His voice had not risen. It was very, very flat. She had found the documents. She had left them for me. Within hours of leaving them, someone set fire to the carriage she was traveling in. He let this sit in the air between them. Tell me what you know about that. Aldrich's composure cracked. Not completely. The man had too much control for complete, but visibly, in the jaw, around the eyes. The crack had the specific quality of genuine surprise, and Adrian watched it with the terrible precision of a man who needed to know if this was one crime or two. I had nothing to do with that, Aldrich said. You found out she was in the files. Yes. My secretary observed her entering the e-study 2 days ago and informed me. I thought she was simply organizing, as she has been doing throughout the house. I did not—" He stopped. His hands had unfolded. They were flat on his knees. "I did not arrange anything of that nature. I would not. Whatever my choices regarding the accounts, I am not—" "Then who knew?" Adrian's voice was absolute. "Who else knew the scope of what you'd done? Who had reason to protect it?" Aldrich's mouth opened, closed. Marcus. The name was the last warning that existed in this room. "Who else?" "Aldith," Aldrich said, very quietly. "Aldith has known from the beginning. The arrangement required his cooperation." The shape of it settled into place. Not Aldrich operating alone. Aldrich as a mechanism, as the internal access point for something with a larger architecture. The consortium, the political positioning, the systematic financial hemorrhage of the Blackthorne estate's independent leverage. And Clara, who had found it by accident and thoroughness, who had left her careful notes for him to find, who had been set on fire not by a panicked advisor covering his tracks but by something that had been watching the estate and its new Duchess, and had decided she was a thread that needed cutting. Adrian turned and walked to the door. "Adrian!" Aldrich's voice followed him. "What are you—" "You're confined to these rooms until I decide how this proceeds formally." He opened the door. "If you leave this wing before I return, I will interpret that as a decision you've made, and I will respond accordingly." He pulled the door closed behind him without force, because force would have suggested he was not in control of what he was feeling. And he was in control of it. He was holding it with both hands. He was walking it down the north wing corridor with the steady, deliberate pace of a man who had somewhere to be and something to do and could not afford the luxury of what was happening behind his sternum. Clara had been inside a burning carriage for 4 minutes because she had done his work. She had done his work because she had walked into his estate and found the things that needed finding, had organized the things that needed organizing, had stood up in rooms full of people who should have known better and made them feel the specific discomfort of being exactly as small as they were. She had done all of it without being asked, without being acknowledged, without being given a single reason to invest in this estate beyond the cold contractual terms of a marriage designed to require nothing from either of them. And someone had tried to kill her for it. He stopped at the top of the north wing staircase, put one hand on the stone balustrade, breathed. The estate was quiet around him, the deep, specific quiet of a large house after midnight, when the staff has settled and the fires have burned to coals and the building itself seems to consolidate into something more essential and structural. He had stood in this quiet 100 times. It had always felt like his, like the reward of a man who had chosen solitude deliberately and found it worth the price. It felt different now. It felt like something was missing from it. He took the stairs to the second floor. He walked the east wing corridor, past the sitting rooms, past the library entrance, to the door of the Duchess's apartments. He stopped outside it. He could hear, faintly through the old stone wall, the sound of movement. Mrs. Ashbury's voice, very low, and then silence. He did not knock. He stood outside the door for a moment that lasted longer than he intended, his hand not quite raised, not quite retreating. There was something he needed to say to her, and the something was not an apology, though it was related to one, and it was not a report of what he had found, though it included that, and it was something he had not said to a person in 7 years, something that his mouth had lost the precise mechanics of, the specific calibration required for honesty that has no angle to it, no management, no survivable escape hatch. His hand came down without knocking. He walked back to his own apartments at the far end of the house. He did not sleep. He sat at the window in the dark and looked out at the estate grounds and thought about Aldith, about the consortium, about 26 months of systematic theft and the political architecture behind it. He mapped what he knew against what needed confirming and built, in the silent working architecture of a mind that had been trained for exactly this, the shape of what came next. Somewhere in the thinking, without his permission, the image of Clara's face kept arriving. Not the fear in it, not the smoke-blurred moment of her opening her eyes in the drive, but the earlier version, the version from the dinner table and the library and the royal gathering, the version that had been doing the specific, unglamorous, essential work of keeping this estate from going quietly to pieces while its master had been too insulated inside his own constructed damage to notice. He noticed now. The problem with noticing, the problem he had specifically engineered his life to avoid, was that once you started, the noticing did not stop at convenient points. It went further than you planned. It went into rooms you had locked and presented you with the inventory of what was inside them. He was sitting in the dark in his own house, counting the cost of 7 years of correctly managed indifference. And the cost was sitting in a smoke-damaged room down the corridor. And in the morning, he was going to have to stand in front of her and be, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, the person he actually was, rather than the person he had found survivable to become. The window fogged slightly with his breath. Outside, the estate grounds were dark and still and patient. Inside, in the east wing, in a room Adrian Blackthorne had walked past every day for 2 months without stopping, a door that was 300 feet and 7 years and 1 burning carriage away from where he sat, Clara lay awake with the same information and none of the same history to contain it, and she was making, in the careful and solitary way that she made all decisions, a calculation of her own. Whether the man who had pulled her from that carriage was the same man who had promised her nothing on their wedding night. Whether what she had felt in his arms on that gravel drive, the particular quality of held, the particular quality of not going to let you go, was something she was allowed to keep believing in. Whether a man who had built his survival on distance could survive what was coming if he chose, this time to stay close. 40 feet below, in the north wing, Marcus Aldrich sat in his chair and did not move and did not sleep, and looked at the wall with the expression of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. And in a study on the other side of the city, in a house full of other people's money and other people's leverage, Carver Aldith's messenger service was already active, because Aldith had men inside this estate who reported to him, and one of them had already sent word, and Aldith understood with the specific clarity of a man who had been building something for 3 years that the Blackthorne problem had just become significantly more complicated. In the morning, everything would move. The question was who would move first. Dawn came without mercy. It arrived the way December dawns do in the north. Not gradually, not with any of the warming transition that makes light bearable, but as a cold gray fact imposed on a sky that had not finished being dark. Adrian was already at his desk when it happened. He had been there since 3 a.m, working through the primary account ledgers that his secretary had pulled at his request the previous night, cross-referencing against Clara's 6 sheets of careful handwriting, building the full picture with the methodical patience of a man who understood that incomplete information was more dangerous than no information at all. By 6, the picture was complete. It was worse than the 6 sheets had suggested. The diversions from the estate's operating accounts totaled a sum that, stated plainly, represented approximately 30% of the Blackthorne estate's liquid reserves over 26 months. Not catastrophic. The estate was large enough, old enough, with enough structural assets that 30% of liquid reserves was survivable. But it wasn't the sum that mattered, it was the destination. Aldith's consortium had not simply received the funds, it had used them, used the Blackthorne name attached to them, the Blackthorne financial weight implicit in the deposits, to secure commitments from 4 other noble houses whose cooperation it needed for the Eastern appointment play. Adrian's money had been used as a credential. His estate's investment had been cited in private meetings as evidence of Blackthorne alignment with Aldith's political project. He had been enrolled in something without his knowledge. His name was on a ledger somewhere that he had never signed. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and let this settle into him with the full weight it deserved. Not the managed partial acknowledgement of a man protecting himself from the complete impact of a thing, but the complete impact. 12 years. Aldrich had sat across from him at this desk, in this room, had traveled with him, had advised him through the wreckage of his first marriage and the subsequent years of reconstruction, had been present for every significant decision the estate had made in over a decade, and had been building an exit strategy, or a leverage play, or both, for at least 2 years of it. The part of Adrian that had never fully trusted anyone took no satisfaction in being confirmed. That part had simply always known this was the eventual shape of things, and knowing had not made it cost less. He stood, straightened his jacket, went to find Holt. But the meeting was set for 9 a.m, in the estate's formal receiving room, the room reserved for occasions that required the full weight of the Blackthorne institutional presence, the high ceilings and the severe furniture and the particular quality of light from the north-facing windows that made everything look like a proceeding. Adrian had Holt bring Aldrich down at 8:55. He had also, at 7 that morning, sent a rider to the city with a sealed letter addressed to Lord Chancellor Price, the Crown's senior legal officer, a man Adrian had cultivated a careful, transactional relationship with over the past several years, founded entirely on their mutual disdain for Carver Aldith and the political architecture Aldith represented. The letter was precise and brief. It outlined the financial diversion, the consortium connection, and the carriage fire. It asked for nothing except acknowledgement of receipt and the Chancellor's awareness. It was not yet an accusation before the Crown. It was a line in the water. Aldrich entered the receiving room looking like a man who had also not slept and had made some internal decision about how he was going to carry that. He was dressed properly, coat, cravat, the full presentation of his station, and he sat in the chair Adrian indicated with the composure of someone who had decided that composure was the last territory he owned and intended to defend it. Adrian stood at the window. He did not sit. "I've completed the account review," he said. "I know the full sum. I know the consortium timeline. I know that my name has been used in at least 4 private solicitation meetings as evidence of Blackthorne investment." He turned from the window. "What I don't know yet is whether the carriage was Aldith's decision or yours." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "I told you last night. You told me you hadn't arranged it. I'm asking you whether you told Aldith that Clara had found the documents." A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "I sent a message yesterday afternoon," Aldrich said. "I informed him that the Duchess had been in the East Study files. I did not request any action. I did not suggest—" "You told Aldith that the woman who had found evidence of his financial operation was traveling alone on a rural road that afternoon." Adrian's voice had not risen. It was the voice from the royal gathering, from the corridor outside Aldrich's door, flat and surgical and completely without the quality of mercy. "You handed him the information. What he did with it is on you as much as him." Aldrich's composure held, but something beneath it was shifting. The foundation of a man who had constructed his self-justification on the premise that intention absolved him of consequence, and was now being required to look at consequence directly. "I did not believe he would—" "You didn't think about what he would do because thinking about it would have required you to confront what you were already part of." Adrian crossed the room. He stopped 6 feet from Aldrich's chair and looked down at him with the expression that the estate's staff would not have been able to describe easily. Not rage, not contempt, but something more total than both. "My wife was in that carriage." The word "my" arrived in the room with a weight that neither of them had anticipated. Aldrich looked up at him. "You need to consider," Aldrich said carefully, "the full position you're in before you move against Aldith formally. His consortium includes representation from—" "I know exactly who his consortium includes." "Then you know that a formal accusation before the Crown implicates documentation that traces back to this estate. Your estate, Adrian, your financial records showing participation. Participation one did not authorize. That distinction will take time to establish, time during which the Blackthorne name will be under active investigation, during which your seat on the Northern Trade Commission will be suspended pending review, during which every alliance you have built—" Aldrich stopped. He looked at his hands. "I am telling you this not as a defense. I am telling you this because it is the reality of the position." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "You built me a cage," he said. "And you're telling me the dimensions." Aldrich said nothing. "Get out of this room," Adrian said. "You will remain in your apartments. You will not send any further messages. If I find that you have contacted Aldith or anyone connected to the consortium, I will skip the formal proceedings and deal with this through channels that don't require documentation." He held the silence. "Do you understand what I mean by that?" It was not a question. Aldrich stood. He was careful about it, careful and slow, with the particular caution of a man who understood that the speed at which he moved out of this room mattered. At the door he stopped, his back to Adrian, his hand on the frame. "I believed I was protecting the estate," he said. No, Adrian said. You believed you were smarter than I was. That's a different thing. Aldrich left. Clara was in the library at 10. Adrian had known she would be, the same way he had come to know the other patterns of her, not because she was predictable in any diminishing sense, but because she was consistent, and consistency was something he had learned to read in her the way you learn to read weather. She was at the east window again, not the chair this time, but standing, one hand braced on the frame, looking out at the estate grounds with the particular stillness of someone processing a large amount of information in a very small amount of visible space. She was wearing dark gray. Her hair was up. The minor burns on her forearms had been wrapped in clean linen, and she wore them without comment or concealment, the way she wore everything that had been done to her. Present, undisguised, not an object of pity. She turned when he entered. Her eyes found him immediately. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Better than last night." A brief pause. "Graves would tell you otherwise." Graves is conservative by professional necessity. He crossed to the center of the room and stopped. There was a quality to the space between them this morning that was different from every other morning in the library. Less managed, less protected by the architecture of mutual non-engagement they had built over 2 months. The carriage had burned that architecture along with everything else. "Tell me what you found in the East Study," he said. "Walk me through it." She looked at him for a moment, then she crossed to the reading table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. She folded her hands on the table and began. She was thorough. She was precise. She told him the sequence of her discovery, the initial filing anomaly she had noticed while organizing the archive, the pattern she had followed from the supplier contracts backward into the transfer records, the 6 weeks of intermittent, careful cross-referencing that had produced the notes he had read. She told it without editorializing, without performing the significance of what she had done, in the same tone she used when she told him about grain contracts and window casements. He listened without interrupting. He was watching her face, the specific quality of her attention as she spoke, the way she tracked his response without obviously tracking it, calibrating each piece of information against his reception of it. She was reading him. She had been reading him for 2 months, probably, with the same careful attention she applied to everything that mattered. When she finished, he said, "Aldrich sent a message to Aldith yesterday afternoon, after he knew you'd been in the files." The air in the room changed. Clara's hands, which had been still on the table, became more still. The specific, deliberate stillness that is not rest, but its opposite. "Aldith arranged the carriage," she said. "Almost certainly. The message gave him the schedule, the route, the target." A long beat. "Did Aldrich know what Aldith would do with it?" "He says he didn't." "Do you believe him?" "I believe he told himself he didn't know," Adrian said. "That's not the same thing." Clara looked at the table. Something moved through her face. Not the controlled performance of composure he had seen at the royal gathering, but the real thing, the actual internal movement of a person absorbing a piece of information that has implications beyond what she had planned for. She had found fraud. She had not, apparently, planned for the possibility of becoming the direct target of what that fraud was protecting. "Aldith has 4 other noble houses involved," Adrian said. "My name has been used to solicit at least 2 of them. Moving against him formally exposes the estate to a period of significant legal and political vulnerability." "But you're moving against him anyway." It was not a question. She had looked up and she was reading him again, and she had found the answer somewhere in the architecture of him that was apparently, after 2 months, no longer entirely opaque. "Yes," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, something quieter and more internal. The expression of someone recalibrating an estimate. "What do you need from me?" she said. He looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to have a weight to it. "The original notes," he said. "The 6 sheets from the East Study. I need them as part of the formal documentation. They're in the East Study where I left them. I didn't move them." A pause. "There's also a 7th sheet I didn't include. I wasn't certain about the pattern yet. It involves a different set of transfers, routing through what appears to be a secondary account I couldn't fully trace. I left it separate." "Show me." She stood. They went to the East study together, side by side down the corridor, not speaking, in a silence that was not the silence of two strangers sharing a house, but of two people moving toward the same point with the same information and the same direction. In the study, she went to the secondary desk and opened the bottom drawer and retrieved the seventh sheet. She laid it on the desk surface. He stood beside her, close, the closest they had stood without the duress of fire or crowd, and looked at the sheet. The seventh sheet was different from the others. The transfers she had traced on it were smaller, more irregular, routed through a name he didn't recognize. A commercial factor in the Eastern Port District, the kind of intermediary used for transactions designed not to be traced directly. But the routing signature at the end of the chain, the ultimate destination that Clara had partially traced before stopping, resolved, in Adrian's reading of it, to something that turned the temperature of the room down by several degrees. It resolved to a personal account, not Aldith's consortium, not the estate's operating accounts. A personal account registered under a name that was not Marcus Aldrich's name, and was not Aldith's, and was not anyone connected to the consortium structure. It was a name he recognized from the Crown's Eastern appointment records. A name that indicated that what Aldith had been building was not simply a financial leverage play against the Blackthorne estate, but a conduit to something with direct access to the Crown's administrative structure. The full scope of it settled into him like cold water into stone, slowly, completely, with the patience of something that intends to stay. "You stopped here," he said. "I couldn't trace the final account with the records I had access to." She was looking at the sheet. Her voice was careful and controlled, and underneath the control was the specific tension of a person who understands that they are standing at the edge of something much larger than they came looking for. "What is it?" He considered for a brief moment the available options. He could manage this, could give her a partial answer, could contain the information within the boundaries of what he had decided she needed to know, could maintain the specific measured distance that had been his management strategy for 2 months and for 7 years before that. He looked at the name on the seventh sheet. He looked at the woman beside him who had found it. "It's a conduit to someone inside the Crown's Eastern office," he said. "Someone with appointment authority." He set the sheet down. "Aldith isn't trying to influence the Eastern appointments. He's already done it. He has someone inside." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Then it's not financial fraud," she said. "No. It's political subversion." "Yes." The weight of that word, subversion, settled between them. It changed the nature of everything. It changed the scale of what Adrian had sent to the Lord Chancellor this morning, and the Lord Chancellor's likely response, and the speed at which Aldith would move when he understood that the carriage fire had failed and the Blackthorne Duke was now in possession of the seventh sheet. "He'll move today," Adrian said. It wasn't directed at Clara. It was the thinking out loud of a man who had spent all night in his own company and was, for the first time, thinking with someone else in the room. When his man reports the carriage failed and Clara is alive, he'll move to protect the conduit account before I can formalize the documentation. Can he suppress it? If he reaches the right people before the Chancellor sees my letter, yes. How long does the letter take? The writer left at 7. The Chancellor's office receives priority correspondence before noon. He looked at the window. The clock on the wall read 11:40. 20 minutes, maybe less. Clara turned to face him fully. Her gray eyes were direct and completely without the quality of waiting to be told what to think. "And if the Chancellor receives it and acts," she said, "what happens to Aldrich?" The question landed differently than he expected. Not softly. Clara did not ask questions softly, but with a precision that indicated she was asking about more than the legal outcome. "He will face formal proceedings," Adrian said. "The Crown takes financial conspiracy seriously. The carriage fire, if it can be proven, and it can be proven, Pell's testimony is sufficient, adds an attempted murder charge to a financial one. And Aldith will use every resource he has to separate himself from the carriage. He'll argue the consortium was legitimate investment activity. He'll make the estate's documented involvement the primary narrative." Adrian's voice was flat. "He'll try to make me the story." Clara looked at him. "Then you need to be in that room before he can construct the story," she said. "You need to be in front of the Chancellor before Aldith's people are." He looked at her. "You need to go now," she said. Not a writer. You, in person. She held the look, steady as the stone walls around them. A letter can be intercepted. A Duke of Blackthorne standing in the Lord Chancellor's office cannot. She was right. He had known it the moment the full scope of the seventh sheet had resolved, and had been calculating the logistics of it with the part of his mind that ran parallel to everything else, and she had simply said it out loud before he did. "The estate," he said, "while I'm gone." "I've been running it for 2 months," Clara said. There was no sharpness in it, just the flat truth of a woman stating what was accurate. He looked at her for a long moment. Something he could not fully name was happening in the space between them. A renegotiation, conducted entirely in silence, of what they were to each other, and what this house meant, and what the next several hours required of both of them. He crossed to the desk. He wrote 2 letters in quick succession, one to Holt outlining the instructions for Aldrich's confinement and the household's security posture, one to the estate's legal representative in the city, alerting him to be available. He folded and sealed both. He turned to hand them to Clara, and she was already standing at the right distance, her hand out. She took the letters. She looked at them. She looked at him. Adrian. His name in her mouth, with that particular weight, not the formal address of a wife managing a house, but something more direct, more personal, the word a person uses when they need to be heard as themselves rather than their role. Come back. The 2 words hit him somewhere he hadn't defended because he hadn't known it needed defending. He held the look for 1 full second. Then he said, with a quietness that was not managed distance, but its exact opposite, "I will." He left through the east corridor. He heard, as he turned the corner, the sound of Clara moving, back toward the main house, already in motion, already doing the next required thing, with the efficiency of a woman who had made a decision and was inhabiting it completely. He was halfway down the main stairs when Holt appeared below him, his face carrying the specific configuration of a man who has just received information that requires immediate transmission. "Sir," Holt's voice was low, "there are 2 men at the estate gate, mounted. They're carrying the Aldith household seal." Adrian stopped on the stairs. Aldith had not waited for the carriage report. He had moved preemptively, had sent men to the Blackthorne estate before confirmation, which meant either Aldith had someone inside the estate still feeding information in real time, or he had anticipated this outcome from the moment he arranged the carriage and had staged this response in advance. Both possibilities were worse than the other. "How long have they been at the gate?" he said. "They arrived approximately 8 minutes ago. They're requesting an audience. They have a letter, sealed with both the Aldith seal and—" Holt paused, with the precision of a man delivering information whose significance he fully understood. "And the Crown's Eastern Office seal, a joint correspondence." The Crown's Eastern Office. The conduit on the 7th sheet was not simply an asset Aldith had placed. It was someone with enough authority to issue joint correspondence from the Eastern Office, someone who had already been informed that the Blackthorne estate was in possession of documentation and had moved with Aldith in concert, and was now standing at his gate with the combined authority of a noble house and a crown department and whatever legal mechanism they had already prepared to use it. Adrian stood on the stairs and understood, with the particular and devastating clarity of a man who has just had the last of his available moves removed, that the situation had changed. The Lord Chancellor's office was 40 minutes from the estate. The letter had left at 7. It was now nearly noon. He did not know if the letter had arrived. He did not know if the right people had read it. He did not know if the conduit inside the Eastern Office had already intercepted it. What he knew was that there were 2 men at his gate carrying the combined authority of his enemy and a compromised Crown Department, and that his chief advisor was confined in the North Wing and could not be trusted, and that his name was on financial documentation he had never signed, and that somewhere in the city, Carver Aldith was watching to see what the Duke of Blackthorne did when he was backed into a corner with no clean exit and the walls closing from 3 directions at once. 7 years ago, in a different corner with a different betrayal, Adrian had done what men do when the walls close. He had stopped feeling, stopped trusting, stopped being the kind of person who could be hurt by either. He had built the distance. He had maintained it. He had called it survival. He looked back up the stairs, at the east corridor, at the direction of the library, at the house that had been cold and empty and accurate before a woman in dark green silk had walked into it and started the slow, precise work of making it mean something. The thing about having something you could lose, the thing he had spent 7 years avoiding, was that it changed the calculation. Not by making you weaker, by making the cost of losing it specific and personal and impossible to manage from a distance. He could not protect the estate from a distance. He could not protect Clara from a managed remove. He could not do what the next several hours required of him while remaining the man he had decided 7 years ago to stay. He turned back and looked at Holt. "Bring them in," he said. "The East formal room, not the receiving room. I want them inside before they can report back on the estate's posture." "Yes, sir." "And Holt." Holt stopped. "Find the Duchess and tell her what's at the gate. She needs to know everything." The instruction came out of him without the usual processing, without the management. He heard himself say it and recognized, with a kind of cold, clear precision that had nothing to do with calm, that he had stopped operating as a man protecting himself from consequences and had started operating as something else. What that something else was had a name. He wasn't ready to say it, but he was already acting from it, and the two men at his gate were about to find out exactly what that looked like. The walls were closing. He walked toward them. The two men were named Ferris and Crane. Adrian knew this because Holt announced them by name with the formal precision of a man who understood that naming gave Adrian information and gave the visitors the impression that their identities had been expected. They entered the East formal room in the manner of men who had been sent by someone who had prepared them for resistance, measured, practiced, carrying the joint correspondence with the specific grip of people who understood they were holding a weapon and had been told exactly when to deploy it. The East formal room was the estate's most deliberately intimidating interior space. His grandfather had designed it for exactly this purpose. High stone walls, sparse furniture, the Blackthorne family standard mounted on the north face, every element calibrated to make the person standing in the center of the room feel the weight of what they were dealing with. Adrian had used it perhaps a dozen times in 7 years. Each time, it had done its work. He was standing at the far end when they entered. He did not move toward them. He let them cross the room's full length to reach him, which meant they covered 40 feet of cold stone floor under the family standard before they arrived at any kind of conversational distance. Ferris was the senior of the two, mid-40s, the bearing of former military service gone slightly to seed, the eyes of a man who had learned to read rooms and was currently reading this one with the specific discomfort of someone who had expected a different reception. "Your Grace," Ferris said. He extended the letter. Adrian took it. He did not open it immediately. He looked at the seals. Aldith's house seal on the left, and on the right, the Eastern Office's stamp, pressed in the particular wax color reserved for official Crown correspondence. The sight of it produced a response in his chest that was not fear and was not calm. It was the response of a man who has confirmed his worst calculation and must now operate from within it. He broke the seals, read the letter. It was 3 paragraphs. The language was formal and precise and had been written by someone who understood legal architecture, each sentence constructed to be technically accurate while communicating something entirely different from its surface meaning. The first paragraph acknowledged the recent inquiries the Blackthorne estate had made regarding consortium investment activity. The second paragraph noted that said activity had been reviewed by the Eastern Office and found to be compliant with all relevant statutes, and that any documentation suggesting otherwise would be subject to formal challenge. The third paragraph advised the Duke of Blackthorne that any further action regarding these matters should be directed through the appropriate channels, and that the Eastern Office looked forward to a productive ongoing relationship. It was not a threat. It was structured precisely to avoid being a threat. It was a wall built from official language, and behind the wall was the message that Aldith's man inside the Crown was aware, was protected, and was capable of making the Blackthorne estate's formal complaint into a 2-sided investigation before the week was out. Adrian folded the letter. He held it at his side. "Tell Lord Aldith," he said, his voice carrying the particular quality of a room that had been designed for exactly this kind of pronouncement, "that I received his correspondence." Ferris nodded. "And your response, Your Grace?" "That's my response." He held the man's gaze. "Tell him I received it." A beat of confusion behind Ferris's professional composure. He had expected negotiation or submission or the specific kind of controlled alarm that people produce when they realize they are outmaneuvered. He had not been prepared for nothing, for the complete and utter absence of visible response from a man who had just been handed a document designed to destabilize him. "We were told to wait for a written reply," Crane said. He was younger, less practiced, and it showed. "You'll wait until I'm ready," Adrian said. "Holt will see to your comfort in the servants' hall." He left the room before either of them could speak again. In the corridor outside the East formal room, he stopped and stood still for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds of complete internal velocity contained inside a body that was not moving. The letter in his hand was a clock. The moment Ferris and Crane reported back that they had delivered it and received no substantive response, Aldith would understand that intimidation had not worked and would move to the next mechanism. Whatever that mechanism was, it would be faster and more direct than a politely worded warning. He needed the Chancellor's office to have received his letter. He needed it to have been read by Price himself and not by an intermediary who might, intentionally or otherwise, route it into a system that Aldith's man could reach first. He needed to know, and he had no way to know, and the not knowing was the specific kind that produced, in men less disciplined than him, panic, and in men exactly as disciplined, a very cold, very focused version of the same thing. He heard footsteps behind him, turned. Clara was coming down the corridor from the direction of the main stairs. She was moving at the pace of someone who had already received Holt's message and processed it and arrived at the same calculation Adrian had, which was the pace of someone covering ground with purpose rather than urgency. She stopped beside him. Her eyes went to the letter. "Show me," she said. He handed it to her. She read it. Her face went through nothing visible, which he had learned meant she was processing something significant and had decided not to perform that processing. "The Eastern Office seal is real," she said. "This isn't Aldith overreaching. He has someone senior enough to issue this formally." "Yes." "Then your letter to the Chancellor is the only move that exists, and it either arrived or it didn't." She handed the letter back. Her gray eyes came up to his. "Do you trust Price?" "I trust his self-interest. Aldith's consolidation of Eastern appointments threatens Price's own position. He has reason to act." "That's not the same as trust." "No, but it's sufficient." She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a person who is deciding something and has almost finished deciding it. "There's a second exit from this," she said. "Not legal, not formal. Tell me." "Lord Aldith held a gathering 6 weeks ago. Every noble family in the consortium was present. I was there. You were there. I spent 40 minutes speaking with Lady Aldith and 2 of the consortium wives." She paused. "They don't know. None of them. The wives of at least 3 consortium members believe their family's investment is a straightforward commercial venture. One of them, Lady Voss, mentioned specific promises Aldith made about returns that contradict what the actual structure delivers." Another pause, more deliberate. "She mentioned a date, a meeting scheduled for this coming Friday, where the consortium members are gathering to review the first returns distribution." Adrian looked at her. "If that meeting happens," Claire said, "and the members discover the returns don't exist, that the distribution was structured to be delayed indefinitely while the political leverage is deployed. Several of them will withdraw. And a consortium that loses 3 of 7 members before its primary objective is achieved loses its credibility with the very crown appointees it's been cultivating." "You got that from 40 minutes with the wives," he said. "I got that from 40 minutes of listening while 3 women described, in the language of proud and slightly anxious spouses, a financial arrangement they didn't entirely understand and trusted their husbands to have vetted." Her voice was flat and precise. "They weren't the source. They were the mirror. What they reflected back told me the shape of what their husbands had been told." He held the look for a full 3 seconds. The letter from the Eastern Office was in his hand. The Lord Chancellor was 40 minutes away and either reading his letter or hadn't received it yet. 2 of Aldith's men were sitting in his servants' hall waiting for a response that was never going to come. And his wife, The woman he had promised nothing on their wedding night, the woman he had designed this entire marriage to require nothing from, had just handed him a second front. "The consortium meeting on Friday," he said. "How do we use it?" The "we" arrived in the sentence without premeditation. He heard it. So did she. Neither of them acknowledged it, but it was there, a single syllable that had rearranged the architecture of everything preceding it. "Someone needs to be in that room," Clara said. "Not you. You'd be recognized and removed. Someone the wives know, someone who was at the gathering, someone who can ask the right questions in the language of social inquiry." She held his gaze. "Someone who has spent 6 weeks learning how these women talk and what they're afraid of and where the gaps are in what their husbands have told them." "No," he said. "Adrian, you were in a burning carriage 20 hours ago." His voice came out harder than he intended, harder than the managed register he usually maintained, raw in the way things are raw when they have stopped being managed. "Aldith knows your face. He knows what you found. If you walk into a room where his consortium associates are gathered, he won't expect it." She stepped forward, just one step, but it closed the remaining managed distance between them in a way that was not accidental. He sent men to deal with the problem. The problem, from his perspective, is contained and frightened and recovering in a country estate. He's not expecting the problem to walk into Lady Voss's sitting room on Friday afternoon for tea. He looked at her face, at the gray eyes that were direct and completely without the quality of waiting for his permission, that had never waited for his permission. He understood now. Not once in 2 months. Not for a single decision that had mattered. The anger in him was not at her. He knew this with a precision that was also, somehow, its own kind of excavation. The anger was at the situation's geometry, the specific, brutal geometry of having something worth protecting in a context that was actively trying to take it. 7 years ago, he had resolved this problem by not having anything worth protecting. It had worked. It had worked perfectly. He had been completely, comprehensively safe. He looked at Clara. "If anything goes wrong," he said, and stopped, because the sentence had more than one possible ending, and he didn't trust himself with all of them. "I know how to leave a room," she said quietly. "I've been leaving rooms my entire life." The Chancellor's reply arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Not a letter. The Chancellor himself, in a private carriage with no house markings, accompanied by 2 men whose posture communicated Crown authority without the insignia that would have announced it publicly. Price was 60, compact, with the face of a man who had spent 4 decades in legal and political environments and had emerged from them looking like everything had been exactly what he expected. He sat across from Adrian in the private study with the letter from the Eastern office on the desk between them and said, without preamble, "Your correspondence was received this morning. I read it personally. I have been aware of the consortium's activities for some time, but your documentation, specifically the 7th account transfer, gives us the name we did not have." He looked at the Eastern office letter with a specific and controlled distaste. "That name belongs to an office I have been attempting to investigate for 8 months. Your Duchess has solved a problem that 3 of my researchers could not." "What do you need?" Adrian said. "I need the original documents, the 7 sheets, the ledgers, the estate's financial records for the past 26 months. I need your formal affidavit and your advisor's testimony, willing or compelled." Price's eyes were flat and professional. "I need all of it before Friday, because on Friday morning I am presenting a formal inquiry motion to the full council, and Aldith's man inside the Eastern office will have his last opportunity to obstruct it when it lands on the council floor. You'll have everything by Thursday night. And Aldrich?" "Confined to estate premises. He will cooperate." Chip Price looked at him with the expression of a man assessing the precise meaning of will. "Your Duchess," Price said. "She compiled the 7th sheet independently." "Yes." "She will need to provide a statement. Her account of how the documentation was discovered, the sequence of her investigation, the chain of custody for the materials." A pause. "If Aldith's legal team challenges the documentation's provenance, and they will, her testimony is what establishes its legitimacy." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "She'll provide it," he said. "I'll need to speak with her directly. Today, if possible. He went to find her. She was in the estate's accounting room, which she had commandeered sometime in the preceding 2 hours, with the 7 original sheets laid out on the large table alongside the relevant ledger pages she had evidently retrieved from the East Study archives. She looked up when he entered. She read his face. "The Chancellor is here," she said. "Yes." "He needs my statement." "Yes." She looked at the documents on the table. Something moved through her expression. Not hesitation, but the particular weight of a person recognizing the full scope of what they have walked into and choosing, with complete awareness, to keep walking. "All right," she said. She was with Price for 50 minutes. Adrian waited in the corridor outside the study, which was not a thing he had planned to do, and which he noticed himself doing with the specific clarity of a man who has stopped pretending his behavior requires no explanation. He waited because she was in that room, and the room was behind him, and the corridor was where he was, and those facts were simply true. When she came out, she looked tired in the way that people look tired after doing something that required everything they had. She stopped in front of him and said, "He believes it will hold." "It will hold," Adrian said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked past him toward the main staircase. "Clara." She stopped. Turned. He crossed the distance between them, 3 steps, 4, close enough that the conversation was entirely private in the empty corridor. He was looking at her face, at the woman who had found his estate's rot, who had been set on fire for it, who had walked into his chancellor's study and given testimony that would determine the outcome of everything, who had done all of this inside a marriage designed to ask nothing of her. "The Friday meeting," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" "And you're right that it's necessary, and right that I can't be the one to do it." He held her gaze. "I don't like it." The corners of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "I know," she said. "If anything changes, if Aldith moves before Friday, if there's any indication as people are aware of the plan, I'll walk away." "You'll walk away immediately, without finishing, without—" "Adrian." His name again, with that particular weight. "I heard you the first time." He stopped talking. She was looking at him with the gray eyes that he had stopped being able to read, as anything other than what they were. Direct, present, carrying the full weight of a person who had decided some time ago that she was going to see this through, and was doing so without requiring his management of it. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly. "I know why you're doing it. And I'm telling you it's all right to let me." The corridor was silent around them. He said nothing. He was doing the thing he had become. The man who had chosen silence over exposure for so long that language for the interior things had atrophied, the specific words for what he was feeling when he looked at her worn down to something he could not immediately locate. But he reached out and took her hand, the hand nearest him, the left one, the one with the healing burns on the forearm, and held it for a moment. Not like the gravel drive, not with the desperate grip of a man pulling someone from fire. Something quieter, something that had made a different kind of decision. She looked down at their hands, then up at him. He released it, turned and walked back toward his study, where Price was waiting and the documentation needed organizing and the Thursday deadline was already pressing against the available hours. Thursday moved at the speed of machinery. Documents were organized, copied, formatted for formal legal submission with the help of Adrian's secretary and the estate's legal representative, who arrived from the city at 10 in the morning and spent the next 8 hours building the evidentiary package with the grim efficiency of a man who understood the stakes. Aldrich, when Adrian came to him in the North Wing at 2 in the afternoon with a formal statement requiring his signature, looked at the document for a long time and then signed it with the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy and had finally, without relief, put it down. Adrian did not speak to him beyond what was necessary. He was not yet at the point of deciding what Aldrich's 12 years meant alongside his betrayal. That accounting would come later, when the immediate emergency had resolved and there was space to do the arithmetic honestly. For now, Aldrich was a piece of the case and nothing more. And the discipline required to hold him at that distance was significant, and Adrian maintained it because the alternative was to stand in the North Wing corridor and say things that would not help anyone. The package arrived at the Chancellor's office at 6 on Thursday evening, delivered by hand by Adrian's legal representative with a second copy retained at the estate. Price sent a one-line confirmation before midnight. Received in full. Presentation proceeds at 9 Friday morning. At 8 Friday morning, Clara left the estate in a carriage with no Blackthorne markings. Adrian stood at the study window and watched it disappear down the drive. The morning was overcast, the same gray as her eyes. The kind of December sky that couldn't decide between snow and rain and had settled on a sullen pressure that made everything feel heavy. He watched until the carriage was gone and the drive was empty, and then he turned back to his desk and attempted to work and achieved approximately 40% of his usual output because the remaining 60% was allocated to a frequency he couldn't turn down. He was capable, in principle, of not knowing where she was for an hour. He had been capable of it for years, in the context of people he was indifferent to. The problem was that he was not indifferent, and had not been for some time, and the knowledge of her absence had a texture that his practiced solitude had never prepared him for. He worked. He received a message from Price at 10:15. Inquiry motion presented. Aldith's legal team formally objecting on procedural grounds. Proceedings ongoing. He received nothing else until noon. At noon, Holt came to the study door. Adrian looked at him. "The Duchess's carriage has returned," Holt said. He was out of his chair before the sentence finished. She was in the entrance hall when he came down the main stairs, unwrapping her coat with the focused, practical energy of someone who has been moving fast and hasn't stopped to feel whatever she is feeling yet. She looked up at him on the stairs, and something in her face, not relief, something more complicated than relief, something that had a story in it, shifted. "Lady Voss," she said, "is furious." He came the rest of the way down the stairs. "Tell me." "The returns distribution that Aldith promised for this quarter doesn't exist. The consortium has been using the capital to fund the political operation, and the members were told a different story. Lady Voss has known something was wrong for 2 months, but had no language for it." Clara's voice was level and quick, the voice of someone delivering a debrief with precision. "I gave her language. I told her what to look for in the documents her husband would have access to. I told her what the discrepancy would look like." A pause. "She was with Lord Voss before I left. I don't know what she said to him, but she had the look of a woman who had been waiting for an occasion." "Voss is one of the 4, Adrian said. "He's the second largest capital contributor. If he withdraws and challenges the structure publicly, 2 more will follow. Aldith needs all 4 to maintain the credibility the Eastern Office contact requires." Her eyes were steady on his. "It won't happen today, but it will happen before the council presentation becomes a full proceeding, and when Aldith's consortium begins to fracture internally, his legal defense fractures with it." Adrian looked at her. At the woman who had walked into a room full of people, connected to the man who had tried to kill her, and had done the work with the same quiet, methodical precision she applied to everything that mattered. He had known men, soldiers, lawyers, political operators of significant ability, who would not have had the nerve for what she had done this morning, who would have found a reason it wasn't necessary, or wasn't their responsibility, or wasn't worth the risk to themselves. Men who had more obvious claim to courage than a quiet woman from a fallen noble family who had been inside a burning carriage 72 hours ago. He didn't know what to do with what he was feeling. He had lost the architecture for it, the specific interior structure required to contain this particular thing, because the architecture had been dismantled slowly over 2 months without his permission, and he was standing in its absence. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. The question had come out the same way it had come out the night of the gathering, after Velt. Not quite a question, carrying more weight than the words justified. "Yes," she said, and then, more quietly, "Ask me again later, when I've had an hour." He almost said something. The something was specific and large and had been building for weeks, and was presently at the precise pressure threshold between containable and not. He held it. Not because it was wrong, but because this was not the moment. Because the morning was not finished, and the Chancellor's proceedings were ongoing, and there were mechanisms still in motion that required his attention, and because what he had to say deserved a moment that was not squeezed between emergencies. "Go rest," he said. She held his look for one beat, nodded, turned toward the stairs. She was 3 steps up when the estate's front door opened behind Adrian. He turned. It was one of the estate's gate staff, a young man named Brecht, out of breath, with the particular expression of someone carrying information they had run to deliver. "Your Grace," Brecht said, "there's a Crown courier at the gate, not a messenger, a Crown enforcement officer. He's asking for immediate access." A breath. "He says he carries a direct warrant from the Lord Chancellor's office." Adrian looked at him. "He says Lord Aldith has been detained pending formal inquiry." Another breath. "And that the Eastern Office contact has been identified and suspended from Crown service pending investigation." The entrance hall was very quiet. Adrian turned back to the stairs. Clara had stopped 3 steps up. She was turned toward him, her hand on the rail, her gray eyes carrying the particular quality of a moment that has been building from 6 sheets of careful handwriting and 2 months of quiet, unremarkable, essential work. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Let him in," Adrian said to Brecht, without looking away from her. Brecht left. The front door was open behind him, the December air coming through it cold and direct. And somewhere in the city, the Lord Chancellor was doing what Crown authority does when it has sufficient documentation and sufficient reason, and the thing that had been built against the Blackthorne estate was beginning at its foundation to fail. And none of that, not the warrant, not the inquiry, not the 7 years of architecture that was currently coming down around him, none of it was what Adrian Blackthorne was looking at in the entrance hall of his own estate at noon on a Friday in December. He was looking at Clara. She was still on the 3rd step, still holding the rail. The gray eyes direct and present and carrying something he recognized now, recognized with the specific, accurate pain of someone identifying a thing they have been avoiding for a very long time. As the same thing that was in him had been in him, building since the morning library and the dinner table and the royal gathering and the gravel drive, since every moment in 2 months that he had filed somewhere he didn't name. The Crown officer was at the gate. The case was breaking in their favor. The walls had come down from 3 directions, and they were still standing, and she was 3 steps above him on the staircase of a house she had rebuilt from the inside while he was busy surviving it. He had something to say to her. He had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept being occupied by emergencies, and he was done waiting for the emergencies to stop, because the emergencies, he understood now, were simply the texture of a life that meant something. The friction of existing in the world in a way that was not managed from a distance. He opened his mouth. The Crown officer's boots were on the front steps. The door opened wider. Adrian looked at Clara for one more second. 1 second in which the full, unmanaged truth of everything he had not said was visible on his face. In the way it is visible on the faces of men who have finally stopped managing it. And she was looking at him with the gray eyes that had been reading him for 2 months, and had, he understood in that second, already read this, had read it and was waiting, with the specific patience of a woman who knew the value of waiting, for him to catch up. The Crown officer entered the hall. Adrian turned. The moment closed behind him like a door, but it did not lock. The Crown officer's name was Harwell. He was 40, direct, with the economical manner of a man who had delivered warrants in enough rooms to stop performing the significance of what he carried. He laid the Chancellor's documentation on the entrance hall table and walked Adrian through it in 12 minutes. Aldith detained at the council chambers pending formal inquiry, the Eastern Office contact suspended and under investigation, a court order freezing the consortium's financial instruments pending full audit. Clean, comprehensive, final in the way that Crown authority is final when it moves with sufficient documentation behind it. Adrian signed the acknowledgement receipt. Harwell collected his copies. He was gone in under 20 minutes, his carriage disappearing down the drive with the brisk indifference of machinery completing a function. The entrance hall was quiet again. Holt stood near the doorway to the east corridor. He had the expression of a man who had served this house through its worst years and was now standing in a room where the worst appeared to be concluding and did not quite know what to do with his face. "Is there anything you need, sir?" he said. Adrian looked at the documentation in his hands, at the formal language of warrants and injunctions that represented the machinery of consequence doing what it was built to do. He had spent 3 days running at full capacity. Every calculation, every decision, every available piece of himself allocated to the emergency's demands. The emergency was now, structurally, over. What remained was paperwork and proceedings, and the long bureaucratic aftermath of a thing that had been resolved at speed. What remained was also everything that the emergency had kept deferred. "Where's the Duchess?" he said. "Her rooms, sir. She went up after the officer arrived." He set the documents on the hall table. "That will be all, Holt." Holt withdrew with the discretion of a man who had been waiting 22 years for the house he served to become something worth serving. 7. He did not go to her rooms immediately. He went first to the east study, the room where the 7 sheets had been laid out, where this had all begun in the most precise sense, where Clara had sat alone with ledgers and a growing suspicion and the particular stubbornness of a person who cannot leave a wrong thing wrong. The documents were gone now, in the Chancellor's possession, but the room held the residue of what had happened in it, the specific atmospheric weight of a space where something significant had occurred and the walls had absorbed it. He stood in the center of it. He had been in this room 100 times. Before Clara arrived, it had been simply a room, functional, occasionally useful, carrying no more weight than its contents. Now it was the room where she had found the truth that had nearly gotten her killed and had ultimately brought down the architecture of everything threatening what he'd built. It was the room where she had left the 7th sheet with a note that said, "I think you need to see this." 7 words that contained, in retrospect, an entire philosophy about what it meant to be someone's partner rather than their obligation. He stood there and did the accounting. Not the financial accounting. That would take months. The full audit and restitution and the legal proceedings against Aldith and the political consequences of an Eastern Office corruption case. That accounting would resolve in the way institutional accountings resolve. Slowly, completely, with the grinding patience of systems designed to outlast the individuals inside them. He was doing a different accounting, the kind that has no ledger and no formal process, the kind that a man does when he has been wrong about something important and must look at the full dimension of the error before he can move past it. He had been wrong about distance, not in the abstract philosophical sense. He had understood for some time that his cultivated isolation had a cost, had chosen to pay it because the alternative cost seemed higher. He had been wrong in the specific practical sense. He had built the distance and called it protection, and what it had actually protected was not himself from damage, but himself from the knowledge of what he was missing. Distance had kept him safe from loss. It had also kept him from Clara for 2 months of proximity, during which she had, without his participation or acknowledgement, become the most essential person in his immediate world. The math of this was not complicated. The math was simply that he had spent 2 months trying not to see something that was directly in front of him, and in that same 2 months, she had saved his estate, rebuilt his household, found his betrayal, survived an attempt on her life, and given testimony to the Crown's senior legal officer that had dismantled a 2-year political conspiracy. All of it without being asked. All of it without being given a single reason to stay invested in his welfare beyond the cold terms of their arrangement. He was not a man who had much patience for self-pity, had learned early that self-pity was a luxury that consumed the time better spent on the actual problem. But standing in the East study, he allowed himself one moment of something adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of what he had cost both of them with his 7 years of managed indifference, what that indifference had looked like from the outside, what it must have felt like to walk into this house and be told on the first night that you would have your freedom and he would have his peace, as though freedom and peace were things that could be divided between 2 people in the same marriage and remain intact. He had offered her nothing, and she had built something anyway. That was either an indictment of him or a statement about her. He thought it was probably both. He left the East study and went upstairs. He knocked on the door of her apartments. There was a pause, the specific length of someone deciding something, and then her voice. "Come in." She was at the window. The same window she had stood at before leaving that morning, the one that faced the estate's east grounds and the bare winter gardens and the fountain that was still turned off for the season. She had changed from the clothes she'd worn to Lady Voss's, She was in dark blue again, her hair down, and she was holding a cup of something warm with both hands in the way of someone who has been cold and is addressing it practically. She looked at him when he entered. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been expecting this and had decided, while waiting, to be calm about it. "It's done," he said. "I know. I heard the carriage leave." She looked back at the window. "All of it?" "The warrant covers Aldith's detention and the Eastern Office investigation. The consortium's assets are frozen. The full proceedings will take months, but the foundation is established." He crossed the room and stopped a few feet from her. Not the managed distance of their first weeks, not the emergency proximity of gravel drives and burning carriages. The natural distance between two people who have stopped pretending the space between them is larger than it is. "Price will want you for formal testimony when the inquiry opens. That will be difficult." "I know. Aldith's legal team will challenge your account of the document discovery. They'll look for inconsistencies, gaps in the chain of custody." "Let them look," she said. There was no bravado in it, just the flat confidence of someone who knows what they did and how they did it. He looked at the side of her face, the profile he had memorized without deciding to, over 2 months of formal dinners and library mornings, and all the unremarkable moments of shared proximity that had accumulated into something he couldn't subtract. The burns on her forearm were healing. The lines of her face in the winter light from the window were composed and tired and real, in the way that only the faces of people who have been through something real are real. "Clara," he said. She turned her head. The gray eyes found him with the direct, patient quality that had been, from the beginning, the thing he could not manage from a distance because it didn't permit management. It only permitted honesty or silence. "I owe you an accounting," he said. She was quiet, waiting. "What I said on our wedding night, the arrangement I proposed, the terms I set it because it was what I needed it to be. Not what was fair to you, not what was honest." He held her gaze. "I told you I wanted peace. What I meant was that I didn't want to be the kind of man who could be hurt by caring about someone again. I built the arrangement around that. I made you a part of a life I had specifically designed to feel nothing inside." The room held this. "And then you walked into every room I had locked," he said, "and opened them, and I stood in the corridor pretending I didn't notice." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was moving, not dramatically, not with the performance of emotion, but in the quiet interior way that real feeling moves when it has finally been given language. "I knew what you were doing," she said. "I know you knew. I knew from the first week, the library, the way you said read your book, and then left and came back the next morning." The corner of her mouth moved. "You came back the next morning, Adrian. You built the arrangement to need nothing, and then you kept showing up." He absorbed this. "I came back because the room was mine," he said. "Yes," she said. "And then?" He looked at her. The window light was flat and cold and honest, and in it her face was entirely without the social architecture that people build for public rooms. The composure, the performance of managing, the careful presentation of a woman who has decided what to show and what to keep. She was simply looking at him with the gray eyes that had read him from the beginning and were reading him now, and had, apparently, always been patient enough to wait for him to read himself. "And then it stopped being just the room," he said. The words landed in the space between them with the specific weight of things that cannot be unsaid, not because they are destructive, but because they are true, and truth has a permanence that its absence never achieves. Clara set the cup down on the window ledge. She turned to face him fully. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for some time." "How long?" "The night of the royal gathering, when you stood beside me for the rest of the evening." A pause. "You didn't do that because it was tactically sound. You did it because you didn't want to leave." He said nothing. She was right, and they both knew it, and denying it would have been the specific kind of dishonesty that neither of them had the patience for anymore. "I've been waiting," she said. "Not for you to become something different. I wasn't waiting for you to stop being who you are. I was waiting for you to stop being afraid of it." The word afraid landed differently than he expected. Not as an accusation, as a fact, stated in the same register she used for all facts, plainly, without ornament, without the softening that would have changed its meaning. He had been afraid. 7 years of it. He had called it other things: discipline, wisdom, the rational response to specific historical damage. And it had been all of those things, and also, underneath all of them, simply fear. The fear of a man who had loved someone and been taken apart by it, and had rebuilt himself around the certainty that he would not permit that particular demolition again. What he hadn't accounted for was the specific woman who would walk into his house and begin, without permission, to matter. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I haven't been, for a long time. I'm going to be inadequate at it in ways I can't predict." "I know," Clara said. "That doesn't trouble you." "You pulled me out of a burning carriage," she said. "You stood beside me at a gathering for 3 hours without being asked. You said my name in a formal proceeding and called me your wife like it meant something." She held his gaze. "Those aren't the actions of a man who is adequate at distance. They're the actions of a man who has been failing at it for months." Something warmer moved through her expression. "I find that more honest than competence." He looked at her. At the woman who had taken the terms of a loveless arrangement and refused quietly and persistently to be diminished by them. Who had earned the loyalty of every person in this house within 6 weeks. Who had found the rot in his estate's foundation and laid it out in 7 sheets of careful handwriting and nearly died for it. And had, upon being pulled from the fire, used her first available breath to make sure he knew what she'd found. That was not the behavior of someone honoring a contract. That was the behavior of someone who had already decided what this was and had been waiting for him to catch up. He reached out and took her face in his hands. Both of them. The way you hold something you have been afraid of losing. And she let him, and the gray eyes were very close and very direct and carrying now the full weight of everything she had been patient about. "Stay," he said. Not the way he had imagined saying it, not with the orchestrated weight of a prepared declaration, not in the formal room with the winter ball and the departing carriage. Simply, stay. One word, stripped of everything except what it meant. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and certain, and had in it the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a question they already know the answer to. "I haven't been." He kissed her. Not dramatically, not with the frantic relief of the carriage drive or the managed courtesy of formal public proximity, the way you kiss someone when you have finally stopped lying to yourself about wanting to. Slow and certain and entirely present, the way that only things chosen without reservation are present. When he pulled back, she was looking at him with the gray eyes that had, from the first morning in the library, refused to look away. "I owe you something else," he said. "What?" "An apology. For the wedding night. For the terms I set without asking what you wanted. For 2 months of conducting this marriage like a transaction while you—" He stopped. "While you built something worth having in spite of it." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were at his chest. Not gripping, just resting, present in the way she was present for everything. "I don't need the apology," she said. "I need you to not do it again." "I won't." "That's a large promise." "Yes," he said. "I know what I'm promising." She looked at him, assessing in the way she assessed everything. Not with distrust, but with the specific intelligence of a woman who had learned to look at the full picture rather than the available surface. Whatever she found in the looking, it settled her. The assessment resolved into something simpler and warmer that lived in the particular curve at the corner of her mouth. "Then we're agreed," she said. The formal proceedings against Carver Aldith opened before the council in the 3rd week of January. Clara's testimony was given on the 2nd day. She sat before the council in the dark green dress she had worn to Aldith's gathering 6 weeks earlier, a choice that was not accidental and that the room registered, and answered every question put to her by the inquiry panel with the same precise, unadorned clarity she had applied to 7 sheets of handwritten notes in a cold study on a December afternoon. Aldith's legal team spent 40 minutes attempting to find inconsistencies in her account of the document discovery. They did not find any. They had not been going to find any. Clara Vale had not built her case on impressions or assumptions. She had built it on mathematics. Lord Voss withdrew from the consortium on the same day. Two others followed within the week. Aldith's legal position, already structurally compromised by the financial documentation, collapsed entirely when the consortium's internal communications, obtained through the Crown's formal discovery process, revealed the full scope of the Eastern appointment scheme in language that removed any plausible distance between Aldith and the conspiracy's design. The Crown's Eastern office contact entered a formal negotiation for reduced sentencing in exchange for complete testimony. He provided it. The testimony extended the case's reach into two additional ministries and produced a secondary investigation that would occupy the Chancellor's office for the better part of the following year. Marcus Aldrich cooperated fully. His testimony was the case's structural backbone, the internal account of how the diversion had been architected, who had authorized each stage, what the consortium had understood itself to be purchasing with Blackthorne funds. At sentencing, the counsel took his cooperation and his 12 years of prior service into account. It was not enough to avoid consequence, but it was enough to determine its scale. He left the proceedings looking like a man who had spent everything he had on a calculation that had failed and was now living in the remainder. Adrian attended every day of the proceedings. He sat at the counsel table in the formal bearing of a man whose estate had been used without his knowledge and whose wife had nearly been killed for discovering it, and he presented the Blackthorne documentation with the exhaustive precision of someone who had decided that the only acceptable outcome was the complete one. Several observers noted in private correspondence that would later surface during the secondary investigation that the Duke of Blackthorne had appeared different than his reputation suggested, less remote, less sealed against the room, more present. They were not wrong. On the last evening of the council proceedings, they drove back to the estate together in the Blackthorne carriage, the formal one, the one that had replaced the vehicle lost to the fire, dark and quiet, and moving through the January dark at the steady pace of a journey that has no urgency left in it. Clara was beside him, not across the carriage, beside him, the specific proximity of two people who have stopped performing distance. She was looking out the window at the winter countryside passing in the darkness, and her profile in the faint carriage light was tired and settled, and more itself than anything he had seen in the 4 months since their wedding. He was watching her. Not the covert watching of the early weeks, the peripheral, deniable, managed observation of a man who wouldn't admit what he was doing, openly. The way you watch someone you have stopped pretending you're not watching. She turned and found him at it. "You're staring," she said. "Yes." She considered this. "Any particular reason?" "I'm thinking about the library," he said. "The first morning, you were in my chair." "Your chair," she said. "I didn't see a name on it." "There wasn't one. There didn't need to be. I had been sitting in that chair at 6 in the morning for 3 years without anyone else in the room. And then I was there," she said. "And then you were there." He looked at her. "I told you to read your book." "You did." "That was—" He stopped. "Rude," she offered. "Rude," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the estate gates were appearing ahead, the familiar line of the drive visible beyond them in the carriage lamp's reach. "You came back the next morning," she said again. The same observation she had made in her rooms, carrying the same weight, not as an indictment, but as the statement of a simple fact that contained inside it the full arc of everything that had followed. "I came back every morning," he said. "Yes." "I'm going to keep coming back," he said. "To the library, to the dinners, to whatever room you're in." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you this because I spent 2 months not telling you things that would have been better said, and I have a strong preference against repeating that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The carriage had slowed at the gate, the familiar sounds of the estate receiving them. The gate's movement, the gravel under the wheels. The particular quality of arrival that belongs to a place that is genuinely yours. "That's the longest thing you've ever said to me that wasn't about the estate's finances," she said. "I'm aware." "I like it," she said, simply, without qualification. The carriage stopped at the front steps. Holt was there, as he always was. The house's consistent, capable presence. The man who had run toward a burning carriage without being asked, and who had told Adrian, in the plain language of a loyal employee, that the estate felt alive again for the first time in years. He opened the carriage door. He looked at the two of them, at Clara first, then at Adrian, and something in his face completed itself. Not quite a smile, something that a smile was made from. "Welcome home," he said. Bassett. The winter ball had been scheduled since October, a Blackthorne estate tradition, held each year in the third week of January, the estate's formal acknowledgement that winter had reached its midpoint and would, eventually, end. Adrian had attended it for 3 years as an obligation, moved through it as a function, left it early each time with the relief of a man returning to a preferred solitude. This year he stood at the edge of the great hall and watched Clara move through it. She was in deep red, a color he had not seen her wear before, a color that was not quiet or managed or diplomatically chosen. It was a choice made by someone who had stopped dressing for the room's expectations and had started dressing for herself, and the effect was the effect that happens when a person stops performing and starts arriving. The hall was full. The same faces, roughly, as the wedding, the same families, the same political adjacencies and social calculations, the same architecture of power and proximity that constituted the world he operated in. But the room had a different quality than the wedding hall. The wedding hall had been a gathering of people witnessing an arrangement. This room was a gathering of people observing something that had become, in 4 months, something else entirely. They watched Clara. They watched the way she spoke to the estate's tenants and the minor nobility with the same quality of attention. They watched the way she moved through a room that was now, unmistakably, hers. Several of them had been at the council proceedings. Several had watched her testimony dismantle Aldith's legal defense with the calm precision of someone who had been prepared for the challenge and had not found it as difficult as hoped. They had recalculated. People always recalculate when they discover they underestimated. The recalculation of a room like this one, when directed at a woman who had arrived as the quiet wife of a feared duke and had turned out to be the reason the duke's estate still stood, produced a specific quality of regard. Not the warm regard of acceptance, but the cooler, more durable regard of recognition. Clara had earned it. She had not performed for it or maneuvered for it. She had simply been, consistently and without modification, herself. Adrian watched her from across the room and felt something he had not felt in 7 years of winter balls and formal rooms and the long, managed performance of a man who had decided he was done with the kind of feeling that made rooms look different. The room looked different. He crossed it. She saw him coming. She was in a conversation with 2 women from the northern families, a conversation that she brought to its natural conclusion without cutting it short, with the unhurried completeness of someone who understands that relationships are worth finishing properly. When she turned to him, she was already smiling. The real one, not the social one, the one he had catalogued in its first appearances weeks ago and had since seen often enough to know its specific quality. "You've been watching me from across the room for 20 minutes, she said. "Yes." "People are going to notice." "They already have," he said. "They've been noticing for months. I'm the last one to stop managing it." She looked at him. The Great Hall's music was playing, something seasonal, appropriate to the occasion, and around them the party moved in the particular self-contained way of large gatherings, and in the specific bubble of their proximity, the rest of it was present but secondary. "Dance with me," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "You don't dance." "I know how to dance." "That's not what I said." "I'm aware," he said. "Dance with me anyway." She took his hand. He led her to the floor, not to the center, where visibility would have made it a performance, but to the side, where the light was quieter and the music reached them at the right volume. He put his hand at her waist, and she came into the proper hold without the careful measurement of managed proximity, closed the way people stand when they have stopped accounting for distance. They danced. He was not a graceful dancer. He was competent, had been taught correctly, and had the fundamental discipline. But grace requires a willingness to be seen that he had spent years withholding, and it showed in the slightly controlled quality of his movement. Clara danced the way she did everything, without excess, without performance, with the specific ease of someone fully present in the thing they're doing. He looked at her face. She looked at his. "Tell me something you haven't told me," he said. She considered this. "I was frightened," she said. "The night of the carriage. Not while it was happening. I didn't have time to be frightened while it was happening. Afterward, in my rooms, when Mrs. Ashbury had gone and the house was quiet." A pause. "I was frightened that the morning would come and you would put the distance back. That what I had felt in your arms on the drive would be something you decided, in the morning, had been circumstance." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost did," he said, "the next morning. For about 10 minutes I stood outside your door and talked myself into the management of it." "What stopped you?" "I couldn't find a reason that held up," he said. "Every reason I had for maintaining the distance stopped being a reason when I tested it against the alternative." He held her gaze. "The alternative being you." She absorbed this with the still internal quality that meant she was taking it seriously, not brushing past it, not deflecting it with a lighter remark, but receiving it the way serious things deserve to be received. "I know what I'm asking of you," she said. "I know it costs you something, being this open. I don't take that lightly." "I know you don't." "I want you to know that I'll be worth it," she said. "Not because I'll be perfect. I won't. But because I intend to be here. Fully. For everything this house requires, and everything you require, and the full complicated weight of both." Her voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I didn't come into this marriage to occupy space, Adrian. I came into it to be part of something. I've been part of something since the first week. I just needed you to agree to it." He stopped dancing. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the face of a man who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey. Not the relief of someone who has been rescued, but the specific earned quality of someone who has walked the whole distance and reached the destination on their own feet. "I agree," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not the language of weddings or formal proceedings, or the public acknowledgement of things that required witnesses. It was the language of two people in a corner of a winter hall, in December's tail end, in a house that had been cold for years and had been warming, one room at a time, since the morning she had walked in and found a misplaced book and put it back where it belonged. Clara looked at him for one long moment. Then she stepped closer, closed the remaining ceremonial inch between them, and put her hand flat against his chest, over the formal jacket, over the place where his heart was doing the thing hearts do when they have been brought back from a long, deliberate stillness. He covered her hand with his. Outside, the January night was cold and clear, and the estate grounds lay in the clean dark of a winter that had reached its depth and would, from here, begin its slow retreat. The fountain was still off. Would be until spring. The gardens were still bare. The stone and the structure and the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of Blackthorne history were exactly as they had always been. But in the great hall, the Duke of Blackthorne was holding his wife's hand in public and making no attempt whatsoever to manage how it looked. And the room around them had registered this and was doing what rooms of powerful people do when something shifts in the center of them. It had gone slightly, subtly, irreversibly different. The man who had buried himself alive in the particular silence of his own construction had found, in 4 months and 7 sheets of careful handwriting, and a woman who refused to be diminished by his architecture, the thing he had been protecting himself from. It turned out to be the same thing he had been protecting himself for. He had spent 7 years becoming someone distance could not touch. She had spent 4 months making him someone who didn't want it to. The music continued. The hall moved around them. And Adrian Blackthorne, who had stood at an altar in November and promised nothing, who had offered freedom and received in return something he had not known he was missing, stood in his own house with his wife's hand over his heart and understood, with the full, unguarded clarity of a man who has finally stopped running from the thing that was always going to catch him, that this was what survival was actually for. Not the absence of damage, the presence of something worth the risk of it.